The wind over the rolling green hills carried the scent of coming rain and 1,000 unspoken goodbyes. Underneath a vast, gray canopy of clouds, the English countryside lay quiet and still. It was a landscape of ancient stone walls, deep, soft meadows, and ancient oaks that had stood watch over centuries of passing seasons. And here, hidden within the gentle folds of this damp, emerald land, an entire army of young men was waiting. They were a world away from the sun-baked porches, the bustling city avenues, and the quiet farm towns they had once called home. They had crossed a vast ocean to be here, carrying with them the heavy gear of soldiers, but beneath the rough wool and the heavy canvas, they were still just boys, standing on the edge of a vast and terrifying unknown. The days in the camps were defined by the slow, rhythmic cadence of waiting. The air was always heavy with moisture, a cool, clinging dampness that settled into the bones and made the canvas of their tents tight and drum-like. In the early mornings, a thick, silvery mist would rise from the damp earth, wrapping the encampments in a soft, obscuring blanket. In this quiet hour, before the world fully awoke, you could hear the soft, muffled sounds of a temporary city coming to life. The scrape of a match against a boot. The low, rhythmic hum of a melody whistled through teeth. The quiet clinking of tin cups as the first hot, bitter coffee was poured. They sat on the edges of their cots, staring out into the mist, their breaths pluming in the chill air. They were men gathered from every corner of a distant continent, thrown together in this strange, beautiful, and lonely place. There were hands that had only ever known the worn wood of a tractor steering wheel, hands that had stacked groceries, hands that had held books and baseballs, now learning the cold, heavy weight of steel. Yet, in these quiet mornings, there was no talk of war. There was only the gentle murmur of shared memories, spoken in soft, hushed voices so as not to break the fragile peace of the morning. They talked of the smell of pine trees in the Pacific Northwest, of the humid, firefly-lit evenings in the South, of the bright, frantic energy of an East Coast street corner. They shared these fragments of home like precious stones, passing them back and forth to examine them in the fading light. They clung to these memories because they were the anchors that kept them tethered to who they were, a quiet rebellion against the vast, gray machinery of the army that surrounded them. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist to reveal the impossibly green grass of the meadows, the men found small ways to pass the long, stretching hours. Some would sit against the ancient, moss-covered trunks of oak trees, meticulously polishing their boots until the leather shone dark and deep. It was a repetitive, mindless task, a soothing rhythm for hands that needed to stay busy to keep the mind from wandering too far toward the dark waters of the English Channel. Others lay back in the tall grass, their hands folded behind their heads, simply watching the clouds drift endlessly across the sky, finding familiar shapes in the white, billowing masses. But mostly, in the quiet corners of the camps, you would find the men writing. They sat on overturned wooden crates, or leaned against the rough bark of trees, a piece of wrinkled paper pressed flat against a book or a knee. Pencils scratched softly against the grain of the paper, a delicate, fragile sound that carried the weight of the world. Writing letters home was a sacred, quiet ritual. It was a bridge built of graphite and ink, stretching across the dark, cold Atlantic, connecting a damp tent in a foreign field to a warm kitchen table thousands of miles away. You could see the intense concentration on their young faces, the furrowed brows, the slight bite of the lower lip as they searched for exactly the right words. They wanted to pour out their hearts, to speak of the profound, aching loneliness, the sudden, sharp spikes of fear that would wake them in the middle of the night. But they rarely did. Instead, they wrote of the beautiful English spring. They wrote of the polite, quiet locals who offered them warm tea. They wrote that the food was not so bad, that the blankets were warm enough, that their socks were dry. They wrote lies born of a profound and protective love. They smoothed over their own anxieties to spare the mothers, the wives, and the sweethearts waiting by the mailbox. "Do not worry about me," the pencil scratched into the paper. "I am fine. I am safe." They folded these fragile assurances into neat squares, sealing them with a quiet prayer, and trusting their deepest longings to a canvas mailbag. hoping the ink would not smudge before it reached the hands of the one who mattered most. The locals of the surrounding villages watched these young strangers with a quiet, knowing empathy. They had seen war touch their own shores, had felt the sting of loss, and they recognized the hollow, nervous energy that hid beneath the boisterous laughter of the young men. There were profound, unspoken moments of kindness exchanged across the hedgerows. An older woman with silver hair and a worn apron handing a warm, cloth-wrapped loaf of bread over a stone wall to a blushing, stammering boy in a green uniform. A local farmer pausing his work to point out a dry path through the muddy fields, his withered face breaking into a gentle, reassuring smile. These small interactions were a quiet balm to the isolated men. It reminded them of the enduring goodness of the world, of the quiet, everyday humanity that they were preparing to step into the dark to protect. They would share a cup of tea in a dim, crowded pub, the air thick with the smell of pipe tobacco and damp wool, listening to the soft, unfamiliar lilt of the local accents. They were guests in a house that was holding its breath, and they absorbed the quiet resilience of the people around them. As the days bled into weeks, the grass beneath their boots grew worn and muddy. The piles of supplies grew higher, hidden beneath vast nets in the woods. The silence of the countryside began to feel less like peace, and more like the heavy, oppressive quiet that falls just before a violent summer storm. They could feel the invisible clock ticking down, a rhythm that beat in time with their own racing pulses. When evening fell, the shadows of the great trees stretched long and thin across the meadows, turning the vibrant green to a deep, bruised purple. The camp settled into a profound hush. The glow of a cigarette ember would flare bright for a moment in the dark, illuminating a tired, thoughtful eye, before fading back into the shadows. The men lay on their narrow cots, wrapped in heavy blankets, staring up at the sloping canvas roofs of their tents. In the dark, the bravado of the daylight melted away. The jokes and the laughter were packed away with their boots. This was the hardest time, the time when the mind had nowhere to hide. They listened to the wind outside, rustling through the leaves, shaking the canvas. And beneath the sound of the wind, if they listened closely enough, they could almost hear the low, deep murmur of the ocean. The water was out there, just beyond the horizon. A dark, cold expanse that stood between them and the fires of a broken continent. They knew what was waiting for them on the other side. They had seen the maps, had studied the sand tables, had heard the hushed, grim rumors passed down the line. The fear was a physical thing, a cold stone sitting heavy in the chest. It was the fear of pain, the fear of failing their brothers, and the quiet, terrible fear that they might never walk under a warm sun again. But alongside the fear, there was a quiet, stubborn resolve. They did not want to be heroes. They only wanted to do what was asked of them, to finish the terrible task ahead, and to go home. They found comfort in the steady breathing of the man sleeping in the cot next to them. They were completely alone in their thoughts, yet bound together by a shared, unbreakable destiny. They were a family forged in anticipation, brothers bound not by blood, but by the damp English grass and the looming shadow of the water. So they closed their eyes, letting the soft, rhythmic drumming of a gentle rain on the canvas lull them toward sleep. They dreamed of golden fields of wheat, of the smell of a hot meal on a familiar stove, of a soft hand resting gently against their cheek. They gathered their strength in the quiet dark, hoarding the peace of the English countryside deep within their hearts. They rested, floating in the gentle, fragile space between the lives they had left behind, and the storm that was waiting for them just across the water. The first step off the cold iron ramp was not met with thunder, but with the soft, yielding sigh of foreign sand. The great gray ships had carried them across a restless sea, through a night that seemed to stretch on for an eternity, holding them in the suspended belly of the dark. Now, the water lapped gently at the shore, a surprisingly peaceful rhythm for a place that had already seen so much sorrow. They stepped down, one by one, feeling the sudden, strange firmness of the earth beneath their heavy boots. This was France. It was a word they had traced on maps, a word whispered in crowded barracks, a distant idea written in the margins of letters sent home. But now, it was soil. It was real. As they moved off the beaches and began the long walk inland, the ocean breeze faded, replaced by the still, warm air of a European summer. The roads were unpaved and worn, winding like pale ribbons through the dense, towering green of the hedgerows. And everywhere, there was the dust. It was a fine, powdery chalk that rose in slow, swirling clouds with every footfall. It settled softly on their shoulders, dusted the brims of their helmets, and coated their faces until every man looked like a pale, quiet ghost of the boy he had been just weeks before. The dust was a silent companion, a physical reminder of the thousands of men who had walked this exact path before them. In the quiet of the march, as the only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of boots and the gentle clinking of canteens, the men would look down at the footprints left in the pale dirt. They would step where another had stepped, adding their own quiet weight to the deepening grooves in the road. It felt, to many of them, like walking through the pages of a history book that was still being written, step by weary step. The landscape around them was a place of profound and heartbreaking contrasts. Beyond the dense thickets of the hedgerows lay sweeping apple orchards, the trees heavy with summer fruit. The leaves dappled the warm sunlight, casting gentle, swaying shadows across the grass. It was a place meant for quiet afternoon picnics and the laughter of children. Yet, woven into this quiet beauty were the silent scars of a world fractured. A stone farmhouse with its roof gently caved in, its windows dark and empty. A wooden cart, abandoned by the side of the road, reclaimed by creeping vines. A single, shattered tree standing alone in a wide, silent field. They walked through this surreal dreamscape with their eyes wide, trying to reconcile the pastoral beauty of the countryside with the heavy, nervous anticipation sitting low in their stomachs. The war, for now, was a ghost. It was out there, waiting somewhere to the east, hidden behind the rolling hills and the thick woods. But here, in this suspended moment, there was only the sun on their backs and the road unfolding beneath their feet. As they passed through small, ancient farming villages, the true weight of their journey began to gently settle over them. The villages seemed to hold their breath as the long columns of weary young men passed through. Slowly, tentatively, doors would creak open. An old man in a worn woolen cap would step out onto his cobblestone step, his hands trembling slightly as he raised them in a quiet, solemn wave. A mother would stand in a shadowy doorway, a small child clutching the fabric of her skirt, their eyes wide and dark with a mixture of weariness and fragile hope. These were the faces of the people they had crossed an ocean to find. There were no grand parades, no brass bands playing in the squares. There were only quiet, deeply human exchanges. A soldier, barely out of his teens, stopping to offer a square of rationed chocolate to a little boy with dirt-smudged cheeks. The boy taking it with a shy, gap-toothed smile, a small spark of light in the heavy afternoon. An elderly woman approaching a resting platoon with a heavy tin pitcher of cool well water. She poured it into their metal cups without speaking, her deeply lined face softening as the young men closed their eyes, letting the sweet, cold water wash the dust from their parched throats. They did not share a language, but in those silent moments, words were entirely unnecessary. A gentle nod, a hand placed briefly over a heart, a weary smile shared across a ruined garden wall, these were the true languages of the road. The soldiers saw their own grandmothers in the lined faces of the village women. They saw their own little brothers and the children running alongside the columns. It grounded them. It gave a sudden, deeply personal meaning to the infinite, winding roads that stretched before them. They were no longer just marching across a map. They were walking through people's homes, through the quiet, broken hearts of a country waking from a long, dark sleep. When the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and bruised gold, the columns would finally come to a halt. They moved off the roads, settling into the vast apple orchards or the edges of quiet pastures to make their camp for the night. The heavy gear was unbuckled with tired, grateful sighs. This was the hour when the quiet truly deepened. As the twilight gathered, the men knelt in the soft grass, using small folding shovels to turn the French soil. They dug shallow trenches, the metallic scrape of metal against earth echoing softly through the trees. The dirt here smelled different than the damp earth of England. It smelled older, richer, holding the warmth of the sun even as the evening air turned cool. Once their small shelters were made, they sat on the edges of their foxholes, brushing the stubborn dust from their trousers. The evening meal was quiet, the scrape of spoons against tin, the soft murmur of voices discussing the blisters on their heels, or the sudden, comforting taste of a warm cup of instant coffee. In these gentle, fading hours of daylight, the men retreated into the sanctuary of their own minds. From deep pockets, they pulled out the crumpled, fragile lifelines that connected them to the world they had left behind. Letters from home. The paper was worn soft as fabric from being folded and unfolded 100 times. A young man from a windy plains town sat against the trunk of an old apple tree, holding a letter from his wife. He didn't even need to read the words anymore, he knew them by heart. But he traced the loops of her handwriting with a dirt-stained finger, just to feel the invisible tether pulling him back across the ocean. He closed his eyes, imagining the smell of the linen in their hallway, the sound of the screen door gently clicking shut, the soft, familiar cadence of her voice. Another soldier, a quiet boy who had rarely spoken since they left the ships, held a small photograph of his parents standing on their front porch. He looked from the black and white image to the darkening silhouette of the French hedgerows, feeling the dizzying, impossible distance between the two. The fears they carried were not the dramatic terrors of battle, not yet. They were softer, more profound fears. The fear of forgetting the exact shade of a sweetheart's eyes. The fear of changing so much in this strange land that they would no longer fit into the quiet lives they had left behind. But they did not speak of these fears. They kept them tucked away, safe beneath their wool shirts, guarding them as closely as they guarded their ammunition. Instead, they offered each other small, quiet comforts. A shared match to light a cigarette, the tiny flare of orange illuminating two tired faces in the growing dark. A borrowed blanket thrown over a shivering shoulder. A low, whispered joke that brought a soft ripple of laughter rolling through the tall grass. As full night finally fell, the camp surrendered to the quiet. A million stars bloomed across the vast European sky, a glittering canopy that looked exactly the same here as it did over the cornfields and city rooftops back home. The men lay back in the earth, wrapped in their heavy wool blankets, the scent of crushed grass and settling dust filling their lungs. They listened to the quiet breathing of the army around them. Thousands of men, lying in the dirt, dreaming of home, dreaming of peace. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again. Tomorrow, they would put their heavy boots back onto the dusty roads and continue the march east, into the vast, unknown heart of the continent. But tonight, in the quiet embrace of the French countryside, there was only stillness. The gentle rustle of leaves in the night breeze. The distant, lonely call of a night bird. They were safe here, cradled in the earth, drawing strength from the silent soil and from the quiet, unspoken bond they shared with the men sleeping beside them. They closed their weary eyes, letting the soft, soothing rhythm of the night carry them away, gathering their courage in the dark, ready to leave their footprints in the dust of whatever tomorrow might bring. It happened not with a shout, but with the sudden, collective roar of engines coming to life, carrying them forward into the vast, golden summer. After weeks of crawling through the thick, suffocating green of the hedgerows, the world suddenly broke open. The narrow, shadow-filled dirt lanes widened into stretching ribbons of pale, sun-bleached pavement. The slow, grueling rhythm of marching finally stopped, and the riding began. The men climbed onto the warm, olive-drab steel of the great tanks and up into the slatted wooden beds of the supply trucks. They packed in shoulder to shoulder, their heavy boots dangling over the edges, their canvas bags piled high around them. As the massive convoys lurched forward, slowly picking up speed, a new and wonderful sensation washed over them, the sudden, cooling rush of wind against their sunburned faces. The wind smelled of crushed wheat, of hot engine oil, and of the sweet, blooming wildflowers that lined the endless ditches. For the first time since they had waded through the surf of the continent, they felt a profound sense of release. The heavy, creeping dread of the static lines was replaced by a dizzying, breathless momentum. They had become a great, rolling river of men and machines, pouring out of the dense coastal lands and spilling into the wide, open, beating heart of France. The landscape became a beautiful, continuous blur of green and gold, rushing past their tired eyes like a movie reel spun just a little too fast. In the back of a bouncing transport truck, a boy from the quiet, mist-covered mountains of Appalachia leaned his head back against the canvas frame. He closed his eyes and let the warm breeze ruffle his dust-filled hair, exhaling a long, slow breath. Beside him, a former baker from a crowded, noisy city street absent-mindedly polished his spectacles with the hem of his shirt, blinking in quiet awe at the sheer, vast expanse of the sky above them. They did not have to walk today. For this brief, golden parenthesis in time, they only had to hold on and let themselves be carried. The deep, rumbling vibration of the engines beneath them became a strange, soothing lullaby. It sank into their weary bones, relaxing muscles that had been coiled tight with anxiety for weeks. The gentle, rhythmic swaying of the trucks rocked them into a state of half-slumber, a peaceful trance where the war felt far away, and there was only the endless road and the gentle wind. But as they sped through the ancient stone villages that dotted the countryside, the true, deeply human magic of the breakout revealed itself. The wary, silent, shadowed faces they had seen near the beaches were gone. In their place were sudden, joyful eruptions of life. The towns appeared over the horizon like islands in a vast sea of grass, and as the endless columns rolled down the narrow, cobblestone streets, the world exploded in a gentle chaos of color and emotion. Heavy wooden shutters were thrown open to the sunlight. Men, women, and children crowded the curbs, their faces alight with a mixture of profound disbelief and weeping joy. The soldiers, covered in the pale, chalky dust of the road, looked down from their perches on the rolling steel and saw hundreds of hands reaching up toward them. They were fleeting, beautiful moments, gone almost as soon as they happened, but etched into the mind forever. An old man in a faded blue worker's jacket tossing a bruised, sweet summer apple directly into the open hands of a surprised young driver. A mother holding her infant up high, tears streaming down her cheeks, so the child could see the faces of the men passing by. A young woman with a brightly colored ribbon in her hair, running alongside a heavy truck just long enough to press a fragile, fresh-cut flower into the rough, calloused palm of a weary gunner. They saw lips moving in shouts of blessing, words they could not translate but understood entirely in their hearts. They heard the frantic, joyous pealing of church bells ringing out across the valleys, a sound that had been silenced for years, now echoing in the clear summer air. It was an overwhelming wave of pure emotion. The young men, hardened by the weeks of fear, dirt, and noise, found themselves softening, their voices growing thick and hoarse as they returned the cheers. They reached deep into their canvas bags and threw down whatever small comforts they could spare, squares of dark ration chocolate, tins of fruit, wrapped candies they had been saving for a lonely night. They leaned over the edges of the trucks, watching the children scramble for the treats in the dusty road behind them, waving until the town faded back into a speck on the horizon. These sudden, beautiful bursts of humanity fed their weary souls. It made the heavy steel helmets they wore feel just a little lighter. To these weeping, waving strangers, they were not just weary boys far from home, they were the sudden wind that had finally blown the dark, heavy clouds away. When the convoys occasionally paused by the side of the road to let the heavy engines cool, the silence that followed the roaring motors was immense and peaceful. The men would hop down onto the soft earth, stretching their cramped legs in the tall, fragrant grass. It was in these brief, quiet halts that their private rituals returned. A soldier would retreat into the shade of a wide oak tree, pulling a crumpled, delicate letter from his breast pocket. He would use the precious few minutes of stillness to read lines he already knew by heart. The handwriting was a quiet anchor to reality. "I planted the tomatoes by the back fence like you asked," the letter might say. "The dog still waits by the screen door, listening for your boots." He would trace the ink with his thumb, reading these simple, beautiful words, and then look out at the endless French fields. He sat there, quietly trying to bridge the impossible, aching gap between the peaceful garden in his mind and the grand, rolling machinery of the army stretching out to the horizon. Carefully, reverently, he would fold the paper, tuck it safely against his heart, and climb back aboard as the engines grumbled back to life. As the afternoon wore on, the heat of the day settled like a warm blanket over the columns. Canteens of tepid, metallic water were passed silently between exhausted hands. A shared sip from a battered tin cup was a quiet communion, a small, profound gesture of care. They leaned against one another in the swaying trucks, finding deep comfort in the solid, physical presence of their brothers. A tired head resting gently on a shoulder. An arm draped loosely over a knee. The differences that might have divided them back home, the varying accents, the different neighborhoods, the different lives, had all been erased by the wind and the shared dust. They were entirely dependent on each other, bound together in this endless, rushing journey toward the rising sun. Slowly, the harsh, bright light of the summer afternoon began to soften. The sky turned a brilliant, bruised purple, streaked with delicate ribbons of gold and pale, fading pink. The heat lifted from the pavement, replaced by the cool, sweet breath of the evening mist rising from the fields. But the driving did not stop. The movement was a living thing now, a tide that could not be held back. As deep darkness fell over the countryside, the columns transformed. They became a mesmerizing, winding river of dim red taillights, glowing softly in the blackness like a string of embers laid out across the velvet earth. The faces of the villagers were hidden now, safely tucked away in their stone houses, sleeping in peace for the first time in memory. But the men knew they were still passing through a waking, breathing world. They could smell the sweet wood smoke from unseen chimneys, drifting through the open backs of the trucks, mixing with the cool night air. The wind grew sharper, biting through their canvas jackets, and they huddled closer together beneath their rough, heavy wool blankets. The steady, hypnotic drone of the engines became the only sound in the entire world. It was a deep, mechanical heartbeat driving them deeper into the mysteries of the continent. Wrapped in the darkness, safely held within the gentle sway of the vehicles, many of the men finally let their heavy eyelids close. They dreamed of the fleeting faces they had seen that day, the cheering children, the weeping elders, the girl with the ribbon in her hair. They dreamed of the quiet porches, the gentle hum of crickets, and the soft beds waiting for them across the dark ocean. They surrendered themselves entirely to the great, sudden wind that was carrying them across the map. They trusted the men at the wheels, they trusted the road beneath them, and they trusted, with a quiet, fragile hope, that this endless, rushing journey would eventually lead them back into the light of home. The afternoon sun baked the heavy green steel, turning the great machines into rolling ovens moving through a sea of gold. August in the French countryside was a breathless, shimmering thing. The sky above was a vast, unbroken dome of pale, brilliant blue, completely empty of clouds, pouring a relentless, heavy heat down upon the earth. Through this sweltering, sun-drenched landscape, the endless columns of armor and transport pushed endlessly eastward. The war had found a new rhythm, one not of crawling through damp shadows, but of a great, roaring race beneath the open sky. Yet, for the young men inside the machines, this magnificent, sweeping advance was measured only in the slow, agonizing drip of sweat and the desperate, quiet longing for a cool breeze. To ride inside the belly of a tank during the height of summer was to exist in a world composed entirely of heat, noise, and vibration. The thick steel plates, designed to protect them from the terrors of the outside world, now absorbed the fiery rays of the sun, radiating them inward until the cramped, dimly lit interiors felt like the heart of a forge. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling sharply of hot motor oil, cordite, and the damp, sour scent of their own exhausted bodies. There was barely room to shift a cramped leg or stretch an aching shoulder. They were encased in armor, yet they had never felt so entirely, softly human. At the very front of these rumbling metal beasts sat the drivers. There were boys whose hands, only months ago, might have gently guided a plow horse or gripped the worn leather steering wheel of a delivery truck. Now, their hands were wrapped around dual levers, pulling and pushing with aching, trembling arms to steer tons of steel across the uneven earth. The vibration of the massive engines traveled up through the floorboards, settling deep into their bones, a constant, numbing hum that became the baseline of their existence. Their faces, framed by padded leather helmets, were masks of pale dust, broken only by the clear tracks of sweat running down their cheeks and the exhausted, red-rimmed focus of their eyes. They stared out through narrow, glass-block vision slits, their entire world reduced to a rectangular sliver of the road ahead. The pale, chalky dust kicked up by the tracks of the tank in front of them billowed like thick, dry fog, stinging their eyes and catching in their dry throats. It was a hypnotic, mesmerizing agony. To keep the heavy machine on the road, to keep the pace, to not let the mind drift into the sweet, dangerous embrace of sleep, this was their quiet, heroic battle, fought minute by minute, hour by hour, in the sweltering dark. Yet, within these suffocating, roaring iron rooms, there existed a profound and beautiful tenderness. It was a quiet camaraderie built not on grand speeches, but on the smallest, most vital gestures of survival. A gunner, his own uniform plastered to his back, would silently unscrew the cap of a battered metal canteen. The canvas cover was stained with grease and the ubiquitous white dust, but he would lean forward, gently tapping the driver on the shoulder to offer it. The driver could not take his hands from the levers, so the gunner would carefully tip the canteen to his brother's cracked lips. The water inside was never cold. It was tepid, tasting faintly of aluminum and iodine, but as it washed down a parched throat, it was an absolute grace. They would share a brief, weary glance, a silent acknowledgement of their shared endurance, a promise that they were in this furnace together, and that they would look out for one another until the engine finally stopped. When the dust occasionally cleared, or when they rode perched atop the hot turrets and in the open beds of the supply trucks, the men looked out upon a landscape of breathtaking, tragic beauty. This was the breadbasket of the continent, a rolling, fertile ocean of wheat and rye that stretched all the way to the hazy horizon. The stalks were heavy and golden, ripe for a harvest that the farmers had been forced to abandon. As the convoys roared past, the gentle summer wind would catch the fields, sending long, shimmering ripples across the golden grain, making it look for all the world like a vast, sunlit sea. For the boys from the American Midwest, the sight was a sudden, sharp ache in the chest. A loader from Kansas, sitting with his legs dangling over the side of a half-track, would look out at the endless wheat and suddenly forget the heavy rifle slung across his lap. For a fleeting, quiet moment, the rumble of the tracks would fade, replaced by the memory of the cicadas singing in the tall grass back home. He could almost feel the worn wood of his family's porch steps beneath his hands, could almost taste the ice-cold, tart sweetness of the lemonade his mother would make on afternoons just like this one. He would close his eyes, tilting his face up to the sun, and let the memory wash over him, a cool, soothing river in the midst of the heat. He held onto that image of home not with despair, but with a quiet, stubborn reverence. It was the beautiful, peaceful world he was carrying inside him, a fragile treasure he was determined to protect from the loud, heavy reality of the war. In their breast pockets, pressed close against their hearts, the letters from home absorbed their sweat and the dust of the road. The paper grew soft and fragile, the ink blurring slightly at the edges, until the letters felt less like paper and more like a physical part of their own skin. In the rare moments when the columns halted, pulled off to the side of the road beneath the shade of ancient, leafy poplars, the men would carefully unfold these fragile pages. They did not read them for the news anymore, they read them for the tone. A young mechanic, his hands permanently stained black with grease, would sit leaning against the massive, cooling treads of his vehicle, reading a letter from his younger sister. She wrote about a stray dog she had found, about how the tomatoes in the garden were finally turning red. Simple, ordinary, magnificent things. Reading those words grounded him. It reminded him that somewhere, the world was still soft. Somewhere, the biggest worry was a summer rainstorm, not a hidden mine in the road. He would run a dirty thumb over her careful, looping handwriting, sending a silent, fervent whisper of love back across the ocean. As they pressed on, the golden fields were occasionally broken by the gentle scars of the war that had just rolled through. They would pass the blackened husk of an old wooden cart, resting quietly in a ditch, already being reclaimed by creeping, green vines. They would see an ancient stone wall, its center reduced to a pile of rubble, where bright blue cornflowers had already begun to push their way up through the cracks. The earth, they realized, was endlessly forgiving. It absorbed the shock, the fire, and the heavy metal, and it simply kept growing. This quiet resilience of nature mirrored the resilience blooming within the young men themselves. They were exhausted, their bodies aching, their minds stretched thin by the relentless noise and the heat, yet they found a way to simply keep going. They complained, they sighed, they wiped the stinging sweat from their eyes, but they did not stop. They drew strength from the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man sleeping beside them in the back of a bouncing truck. They drew strength from the old, withered faces of the French farmers who stood by the side of the road, holding out baskets of bruised, sweet summer apples to the passing columns. They were part of a massive, unstoppable machine, but they remained, at their core, profoundly gentle creatures. They were boys who would carefully scoop a wandering tortoise out of the dusty road so it wouldn't be crushed by the heavy treads. They were boys who would spend their last few minutes of a rest halt trying to fix a broken bicycle for a wide-eyed village child. The sunlight glinting off their armor was blinding and fierce, but the hearts beating beneath the heavy wool shirts were soft, carrying the quiet, enduring light of their distant homes. Slowly, mercifully, the long afternoon would begin to surrender. The glaring, white-hot sun would dip lower in the sky, losing its fiery sting, turning the horizon into a bruised canvas of deep orange, lavender, and dusty rose. The shadows of the great tanks would stretch out long and thin across the golden wheat, reaching toward the east like long, dark fingers. With the setting of the sun came the profound, sweeping relief of the evening cool. The air, moving over the cooling earth, carried the sweet scent of damp soil and resting leaves. The heavy armor plates of the vehicles began to lose their heat, pinging and ticking softly in the twilight as the metal contracted. Inside the machines, the drivers could finally relax their trembling shoulders. The gripping, suffocating heat lifted, replaced by a gentle, soothing breeze that drifted in through the open hatches and the vision slits. The men riding on the outside unbuttoned the collars of their shirts, letting the cool air wash over their damp skin. The hypnotic, grinding roar of the advance seemed to soften, becoming a low, steady lullaby in the gathering dusk. They watched the first pale stars blink into existence above the darkening fields. The golden sea of wheat turned to silver in the moonlight. Another day had been carved out of the summer, another endless stretch of road had been conquered. They passed a canteen one last time in the dark, the water still warm, the gesture still speaking volumes of quiet love. Leaning their tired heads against the cool steel of their great machines, they let the gentle, swaying rhythm of the road rock them into the evening, resting their weary eyes, cradled in the soft, cooling shadows of the French summer, dreaming of the quiet, peaceful porches waiting for them at the end of the world. The heavy wooden doors, shut tight against the world for years, finally began to creak open in the golden afternoon light. The rumble of the engines had softened to a low, rhythmic purr as the great, dusty columns eased their way off the endless country roads and into the narrow, winding streets of the ancient towns. Here, the world felt entirely different. The open, sun-baked fields of summer gave way to cool, deep shadows cast by buildings made of ancient, weathered stone. The heavy tires and steel tracks rolled over worn cobblestones that had been smoothed by centuries of passing footsteps. It was a place where history hung thick in the air, a place of tall, silent churches, wrought-iron balconies, and narrow alleys that seemed to hold their breath as the young strangers passed through. The soldiers riding atop the vehicles and walking alongside them were utterly exhausted. The pale, chalky dust of the French roads was pressed deep into the creases of their faces, turning their green uniforms a soft, muted gray. Their shoulders slumped beneath the weight of their heavy packs, and their eyes, though alert, carried the hollow, heavy ache of long days without sleep. They were boys from new, sprawling cities and wide-open prairies, suddenly thrust into a landscape that felt older than time itself. As they moved toward the center of the town, into the wide, open expanse of the main square, the streets were initially empty. The shutters on the windows above remained tightly closed. The town was holding its breath, caught in the fragile, terrifying space between the dark years of occupation and the sudden, overwhelming reality of rescue. The air was perfectly still, save for the low grumble of the idling engines and the soft clanking of canteens against canvas belts. And then, slowly, the town began to wake. A heavy, iron-studded door swung open, just a fraction at first, then all the way. An elderly man stepped out onto the cobblestones. He wore a faded, patched wool jacket, and he leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane. He took a few hesitant steps toward the great green machines, his eyes wide, searching the dust-covered faces of the soldiers. As he saw the white stars painted on the armor, as he saw the young, unfamiliar, gentle faces looking back at him, the cane trembled in his hands. More doors opened. From the shadows of the narrow alleys, the people began to emerge. They came hesitantly at first, as if afraid the vision before them might suddenly vanish into mist. There were older women wrapped in dark shawls, mothers holding infants tightly to their chests, and men with deep lines of worry etched forever into their faces. They gathered in the square, a quiet, cautious sea of humanity slowly surrounding the weary travelers. For a long moment, there were no cheers, no loud celebrations. There was only a profound, overwhelming silence, broken by the soft, involuntary sound of weeping. A young soldier, barely old enough to shave, sat on the edge of a jeep, his hands resting limply on his knees. He watched as an elderly woman slowly approached him. Her face was a map of sorrow and endurance, her eyes swimming with tears. She reached out with a trembling, frail hand and gently touched the rough, dusty canvas of his sleeve. She did not speak English, and he did not speak French, but as their eyes locked, a silent, beautiful language passed between them. It was a language of absolute exhaustion, of unbearable relief, and of a gratitude so deep it felt like a physical weight. The young man felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached up, took off his heavy steel helmet, and offered her a soft, tired smile. In that simple, quiet exchange, he was no longer just a soldier in a vast, mechanical army. He was a grandson, a protector, a beacon of light in a world that had been dark for far too long. The woman leaned forward and kissed him gently on both cheeks, her tears leaving clean, wet trails through the dust on his face. All across the ancient square, these quiet, heartbreaking moments were blooming. The emotional dam had broken. The townspeople pressed closer, their initial fear melting into an overwhelming tide of emotion. They reached out to touch the soldiers, just to feel the solid reality of them. They laid their hands on the warm steel of the tanks, leaning their heads against the armor as if it were a sanctuary. Men who had hidden their finest bottles of wine for years, burying them deep in the cool cellars beneath their homes, now brought them up into the fading daylight. They pulled the corks with trembling hands and poured the deep, ruby liquid into whatever cups they could find, offering them up to the men in the trucks. The soldiers accepted the offerings with quiet reverence. They tasted the rich, earthy fruit of a land they were fighting to heal, sharing a silent toast with the men who had waited so long in the shadows. The children, initially hiding behind their mothers' skirts, slowly grew brave. They crept forward, their eyes wide with wonder, captivated by these strange, dusty men from across the ocean. The heavy, solemn atmosphere in the square began to lift, softened by the delicate, musical sound of children's voices. The soldiers, whose hearts had been hardened by the relentless miles and the fearful nights, melted completely at the sight of them. Heavy canvas bags were unbuckled. Rough hands reached inside to retrieve the small, hidden treasures they had carried for hundreds of miles. Pieces of hard candy, squares of bitter chocolate, and sticks of chewing gum were offered out. The children took them with shy, gap-toothed smiles, their sudden, pure joy shining like small suns in the gathering dusk. A weary driver from a quiet farm town lifted a little girl onto the hood of his truck, laughing softly as she playfully tugged at the fabric of his uniform. In her bright, innocent eyes, he saw the face of his own little sister, waiting for him thousands of miles away. It was a bittersweet comfort, a sharp reminder of what he had left behind, but also a beautiful affirmation of exactly why he was here. He was here so that little girls in ancient stone squares could laugh again without fear. As the sun began to dip below the rooftops, casting the town square in a soft, ethereal twilight, the frenzy of emotion slowly settled into a deep, comforting peace. The golden light faded to lavender, and the shadows stretched long across the cobblestones. The engines were finally turned off, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the profound, heavy silence of true safety fell over the town. The soldiers found places to rest along the edges of the square. They slumped against the cool stone walls of the central fountain, or leaned back against the heavy wooden doors of the church. They unlaced their heavy boots with agonizing slowness, sighing as the cool evening air touched their blistered, tired feet. A young medic sat by the edge of a stone planter, a small, worn notebook resting on his knee. He chewed thoughtfully on the end of a stubby pencil, looking out over the peaceful scene. He wanted to write a letter home, to tell his mother about this day, but the words felt too small, too entirely inadequate to capture the magnitude of what he had just felt. He didn't want to write about the long roads or the blinding heat. He wanted to tell her about the old man who had pressed a single, crushed flower into his hand. He wanted to describe the exact sound of a town breathing a collective sigh of relief. He wanted to explain the strange, beautiful burden of having strangers look at you as if you had pulled them from the depths of the ocean. "We walked into a town today," he finally wrote, his handwriting slow and careful in the dimming light. "The people were crying. And I think, if I wasn't so tired, I might have cried with them. They're just like us, Ma. They just want to sit on their front porches in peace." He folded the paper, tucking it safely away in his breast pocket, close to his heart. The townspeople did not leave them. They brought out blankets woven from soft, heavy wool, laying them gently over the shoulders of the men who had already drifted into sleep. They brought small bowls of warm, clear broth, the fragrant steam rising into the cool night air. The soldiers ate quietly, whispering their thanks in the dark, deeply moved by the quiet hospitality of people who had so little left to give. As the deep blue velvet of night finally settled over the ancient rooftops, the stars began to appear, clear and bright above the square. The air grew still and cool, smelling of damp stone, wood smoke, and the faint, sweet scent of night-blooming flowers. The soldiers lay back against their packs, wrapped in the borrowed blankets. They looked up at the stars, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of their brothers around them. For tonight, they did not have to listen for the distant rumble of danger. They did not have to watch the horizon with anxious eyes. They were surrounded by the quiet, protective embrace of the town they had freed. They closed their eyes, letting the gentle, soothing quiet of the ancient square wash over them. The tears had all been shed, the profound exhaustion had set in, and now there was only the beautiful, silent promise of a peaceful night. Cradled in the heart of the stone city, they drifted away, safe, warm, and surrounded by the quiet, enduring love of the strangers who now watched over them in the dark. The golden dust of summer slowly washed away, replaced by the quiet, relentless drumbeat of the autumn rain. The great, sweeping blue canopy of August, which had watched over their breathless race across the continent, slowly surrendered to a low, heavy ceiling of bruised gray clouds. The world lost its brilliant, sunlit edges, softening into muted shades of brown, slate, and olive. The air, once warm and smelling of crushed wheat and wildflowers, grew sharp and damp, carrying the bitter, melancholic scent of wet earth, bruised bark, and decaying leaves. The season was turning, pulling the heat from the land, and the long, glorious summer march finally came to a slow, grinding halt. The great, roaring engines that had carried them so swiftly now whined and struggled against a new, silent adversary. The pale, chalky dirt roads of France had dissolved under the weeping skies, turning into deep, endless rivers of thick, clinging clay. The mud was a physical presence, a heavy, gripping anchor that tugged at the tires of the trucks and wrapped itself around the heavy leather boots of the marching men. Every step became a deliberate, exhausted effort. The dizzying momentum of the breakout was gone, replaced by the slow, grueling, quiet rhythm of simply trying to move forward in the wet. For the young men beneath the steel helmets, the world shrank. It was no longer a vast, sweeping landscape of liberated towns and cheering crowds. It became an intimate, uncomfortable universe defined entirely by the cold and the damp. Their heavy wool uniforms, designed to shield them from the elements, now drank in the endless drizzle like sponges. The fabric grew dark and heavy, sagging against their tired shoulders, a constant, chilling embrace that slowly seeped through the layers of their clothing and settled deep into their weary bones. Yet, in the midst of this gray, weeping world, the true, quiet strength of these boys began to reveal itself. Without the adrenaline of the summer rush, without the bright sun to warm their faces, they turned entirely to one another. When the long columns finally halted for the evening, pulling off into the sodden, muddy fields or the dripping, shadowed edges of a pine forest, there was no longer the joy of resting in the soft, fragrant grass. Instead, it was a quiet, urgent ballet of survival. They moved with slow, stiff hands, unpacking their heavy, wet gear, searching desperately for a patch of ground that was not already swallowed by the puddles. They drove wooden stakes into the yielding earth, stretching the green canvas of their pup tents as tight as their freezing fingers would allow. Crawling inside these tiny, fragile shelters, they left the vast, weeping sky behind. The space beneath the canvas was incredibly small, barely large enough for two boys to sit shoulder to shoulder, but in the heart of the autumn chill, it became a profound and holy sanctuary. Above them, the rain drummed against the tight fabric. It was a constant, mesmerizing patter, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that drowned out the heavy machinery of the army outside. It sounded like a million tiny fingers tapping against the roof, a gentle, isolating lullaby that wrapped around the tent, separating the two men inside from the rest of the cold, dark world. Inside this dim, canvas cocoon, the quiet rituals of the evening began. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, wet leather, and the heavy, metallic scent of the earth. Slowly, painfully, they unlaced their mud-caked boots, their fingers clumsy with the cold. They peeled off soaked socks, wincing as the chilly air touched their pale, wrinkled skin. It was in these cramped, shivering moments that the deepest acts of human love occurred. A boy from the damp, misty coast of New England, who had learned long ago how to pack his gear against the rain, would reach deep into the center of his waterproof canvas bag. He would pull out a single, pristine, perfectly dry pair of thick wool socks. He would not put them on his own freezing feet. Instead, without a word, he would hand them across the dark space to the shivering boy from the warm, dry deserts of the Southwest, a boy who had never felt a cold quite like this one. The receiving soldier would take them with trembling hands, a silent, overwhelming gratitude welling in his chest. It was a gesture far greater than any medal, a quiet, profound promise that they would carry each other through the freezing dark. Once their boots were off, they desperately sought the smallest fraction of warmth. A soldier would reach into his inner breast pocket, carefully unwrapping a tiny, precious book of matches wrapped in waxed paper. He would strike it against the friction pad, and for a fleeting, magical second, the dim interior of the tent would be bathed in a sudden, brilliant flare of yellow and orange light. The soft glow of the match illuminated their tired, unwashed faces. It cast long, dancing shadows against the canvas walls, highlighting the dark circles beneath their eyes and the fine layer of grit on their cheeks. But the light also reflected in their eyes, revealing a deep, enduring spark of humanity that the rain could not wash away. Cupping his dirty hands protectively around the fragile flame, shielding it from the drafts that slipped beneath the tent flaps, a soldier would light a single cigarette. He would take a long, slow draw, the tip glowing like a tiny, fierce ember in the dark, before passing it carefully to his brother. They passed it back and forth, a silent communion of shared comfort. The whisper of the smoke filled the small space, a warm, familiar scent that briefly masked the smell of the mud. They watched the tiny cherry of the cigarette float back and forth in the darkness like a solitary firefly, a tiny beacon of life holding back the vast, gray night. When the tobacco was gone, they would try to write home. It was a nearly impossible task in the damp. The fragile sheets of paper absorbed the moisture from the air, becoming limp and soft. The graphite of their pencils pressed deeply into the page, threatening to tear the delicate fibers with every word. Yet, they wrote anyway, leaning close to the paper, their eyes squinting in the dim, gray light that filtered through the canvas. They did not write about the misery of the mud or the ache in their bones. They softened the edges of their reality to protect the hearts waiting for them an ocean away. The weather has turned a bit rainy, they would scratch onto the damp page, but my tent is keeping me dry, and the boys are looking out for me. They smoothed the wrinkled paper with careful thumbs, sealing the envelopes tightly, trusting these fragile lifelines to find their way through the endless gray storms and back into the warmth of a peaceful home. When the writing was done, they would lie back against their packs, pulling their heavy, damp wool blankets up to their chins. They huddled close together, sharing the precious, faint warmth of their bodies. And as the rain continued to beat its endless rhythm against the roof, they would whisper. In the deep, hushed hours of the night, their voices were soft and low, blending seamlessly with the sound of the falling water. They talked to keep the lonely chill at bay. They closed their eyes and traveled far away from the European mud, drifting back to the crisp, golden autumns they had known in another life. They spoke of the smell of wood smoke drifting from a brick chimney on a clear October evening. They remembered the satisfying, dry crunch of fallen oak leaves beneath their shoes on a walk to school. They talked of the bright, frantic energy of a Friday night football game, the air sharp and cold, the stadium lights shining like stars against the black sky. They built imaginary worlds in the dark to sustain themselves. A farmer from the plains would describe, in meticulous, loving detail, exactly how he planned to rebuild his barn when he got back, talking about the smell of fresh-cut pine and the weight of a good hammer in his hand. A young man from a bustling city would describe the exact route he would take to his favorite bakery, detailing the warm, sweet aroma of rising yeast and melted sugar that would spill out onto the pavement when the doors opened. They listened to each other's dreams with quiet reverence, absorbing the details, living inside these warm memories together. The stories were a vital fire that they tended in the dark, a gentle, invisible warmth that kept their spirits from freezing over. The rain outside was cold and indifferent, but the space inside the tent was filled with the enduring, stubborn light of their shared humanity. As the night deepened, the whispered voices would slowly trail off, giving way to the heavy, slow breathing of exhausted sleep. The mind could only hold the memories for so long before the body demanded rest. They drifted away, suspended in the space between the damp earth beneath them and the weeping sky above. They were no longer the fast-moving, victorious knights riding in the sun. They were something much softer and much stronger. They were weary souls learning the quiet art of endurance. They learned that bravery was not always a charge across an open field. Sometimes, bravery was simply waking up in the freezing mud, pulling on a pair of damp boots, and forcing a smile for the shivering boy sitting next to you. The weight of the rain pressed down upon the vast, sleeping army, an endless ocean of falling water covering the scarred landscape. But beneath the millions of tiny, green canvas roofs, the men remained unbroken. They slept shoulder to shoulder, anchored by the profound, quiet love they held for one another, lulled by the gentle, eternal rhythm of the storm, resting their tired hearts in the dark, and quietly waiting for the morning light to finally break through the gray. The great iron machine that had raced across the sunlit fields finally met a wall of ancient, unyielding stone. The vibrant, golden energy of the summer had long since faded, leaving behind a landscape painted in quiet, muted shades of charcoal and slate. As the long columns moved eastward into the rolling, misty hills of Lorraine, the wide-open horizons they had grown so accustomed to began to narrow and rise. The valleys grew steep, draped in the heavy, damp fog of late autumn, and there, resting upon the high ridges, stood the silent giants. They were massive, sprawling fortresses of dark, weathered stone, built by kings and emperors in centuries past. Covered in thick, creeping ivy and shrouded in the low-hanging clouds, they looked like sleeping mountains, ancient and immovable. For the young men who had crossed the ocean, boys who had grown up in towns made of clapboard and pine, the sight of these towering stone monoliths was profoundly humbling. They were accustomed to a world that was new and entirely built by hand, a world of wide porches, swinging screen doors, and simple, welcoming main streets. Now, they stood at the foot of an impossibly old world, staring up at walls that had watched generations come and go. The breathless momentum of their grand journey across the continent slowly ground to a halt. There was no racing past these ancient guardians. There was only the quiet, grueling reality of the standstill. The air in the valleys grew colder with each passing day. The autumn rains that had soaked their uniforms slowly began to carry the sharp, biting promise of winter. The wind swept down from the high stone parapets, carrying a damp chill that ignored the heavy wool of their coats and slipped directly into their weary bones. With the forward march paused, the men turned their attention to the earth. If they could not move through the stone, they would have to learn to live in its shadow. They dug into the hard, freezing hillsides. The ground here was not the soft, yielding dust of the summer roads, nor the deep, wet clay of the autumn fields. It was stubborn, filled with heavy roots and sharp, gray shale. The scrape of their small metal shovels against the rock echoed softly through the mist, a rhythmic, exhausting song of survival. They carved out small, shallow sanctuaries in the slopes, lining the damp earth with whatever dry pine boughs they could find, trying desperately to put something, anything, between themselves and the freezing ground. When the digging was done, they retreated into these narrow earthen pockets, pulling their heavy canvas half-tents over the tops to catch the endless, dripping condensation. The world outside shrank to the size of a slit trench, a dark, quiet space where two men could sit shoulder to shoulder, their knees pulled tightly to their chests. It was here, in the cold and the shadows, that the mind became their greatest sanctuary. To hold back the shivering, to fight off the creeping ache of the damp, they closed their eyes and traveled back across the dark, rolling ocean. They built fires in their minds. A young man from the snow-draped woods of the north would lean his head back against the dirt wall, wrapping his arms around himself, and vividly recall the cast-iron stove sitting in the center of his family's cabin. He could almost smell the sharp, sweet scent of dry birch bark catching the first spark. He would picture the way the heavy iron door would glow a dull, comforting cherry red in the deepest part of the winter, radiating a heat so thick and heavy it felt like a heavy woolen blanket draped over his shoulders. He would open his eyes in the dim, gray light of the trench and whisper this memory to the boy shivering beside him. His voice would be low and soft, a gentle, soothing rhythm in the cold air. He described the way his old hound dog would curl up on the braided rug right beneath the stove, sighing in his sleep as the embers popped and hissed. And the boy beside him, a quiet kid from a crowded, bustling neighborhood, would listen with his eyes closed, letting the warmth of the story wash over him. Then, he would offer his own memory in return. He spoke of the tall, clanking steam radiators in his childhood apartment, how they would hiss and rattle to life on a frosty November morning. He painted a picture of his mother's kitchen, the windows completely fogged over with the steam from a massive pot of Sunday soup, the air thick with the smell of simmering tomatoes, garlic, and warm, crusty bread. They traded these beautiful, domestic memories like precious currency. In the shadow of the imposing, unfamiliar fortresses, these shared stories of hearth and home became their armor. The physical cold was real, and it was relentless, but it could not touch the profound, enduring warmth of the lives they held so closely in their hearts. As the late afternoon faded, the shadows of the great stone walls stretched long and dark across the valleys, swallowing the encampments in an early twilight. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees and settling heavily into the trenches. In this suspended, quiet hour, the men would reach into the inner pockets of their damp uniforms, their fingers stiff and clumsy, to retrieve their letters. Writing home had become a delicate, careful act of love. They rested the flimsy, damp paper against the flat sides of their metal canteens, using stubby, worn pencils to trace their thoughts. They could not tell the people they loved about the freezing shale, or the dark, looming castles, or the way their hands shook so badly they could barely hold a match. To share that burden would be a failure of their quiet, protective duty. Instead, they spun gentle, reassuring fables. "We are camped near an old stone castle today," a young soldier would write, his breath pluming in the cold air. "It looks just like the pictures in the storybooks you used to read to me before bed. We are resting now. The food is warm, and my socks are dry, so please, do not worry your heart." They sealed these promises of safety and handed them up the line, knowing that these fragile pieces of paper were the only things tethering their mothers, wives, and fathers to peace of mind. They bore the cold silently, absorbing the hardship so that the people back home would not have to. It was a profound, deeply hidden form of everyday heroism. It was not the bravery of a charge, or the courage of a battle. It was the quiet, agonizing endurance of a boy pretending to be warm so his mother could sleep at night. In the deepest, darkest hours of the siege, the silence was vast and heavy. The ancient stone seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the soft drip of water from the bare tree branches and the low, rhythmic breathing of thousands of men trying to rest. The small kindnesses shared in the dark were the only lights left in the world. A medic, his own hands numb and blue, carefully wrapping a dry, knitted scarf, sent all the way from a church group in Ohio, around the neck of a trembling sentry. Two friends pooling their precious, hoarded rations to heat a single tin of coffee over a tiny, smokeless chemical flame, passing the warm metal cup back and forth, letting the heat sink into their palms before taking a sip. A hand reaching out in the pitch black of a foxhole to gently grasp the shoulder of a brother waking from a nightmare, a silent, steady pressure that simply said, "I am here. You are not alone." They drew strength from the steady, rhythmic beat of the heart beside them. They were completely stripped of comfort, surrounded by mud, stone, and shadows, yet they remained deeply, profoundly gentle. They were an army of boys holding each other together with whispers, with shared sips of lukewarm water, and with the stubborn, brilliant light of their memories. Slowly, the impenetrable blackness of the night sky would begin to reveal a scattering of pale, distant stars. There were the same stars that hung over the sleeping farmhouses, the silent city streets, and the quiet suburban porches they missed so dearly. Looking up from the depths of the earth, the men would find the familiar constellations, drawing an invisible line from the cold, foreign sky directly back to their own backyards. The great stone fortresses disappeared into the night, becoming nothing more than darker patches against the blackened sky. Their ancient, heavy presence faded, replaced by the soothing, infinite expanse of the heavens. The young men nestled deeper into the earth, pulling their collars up against their cheeks, closing their eyes against the chill. They let the whispered memories of roaring fires and warm kitchens carry them away from the frozen hills of Lorraine. They surrendered to the deep, heavy pull of exhaustion, their bodies finding rest in the unlikeliest of places. Cradled in the quiet earth, watched over by the stars, they slept beneath the shadows of history, kept safe and warm by the enduring, beautiful light of the homes they were waiting to see once more. The rain stopped falling, not because the storm had passed, but because the sky itself had frozen. The transition did not come with the grand, sweeping drama of a blizzard. Instead, it arrived in the deep, silent hours of the night, creeping over the hills and filtering down through the bare, skeletal branches of the forests. The damp, heavy earth of late autumn, which had clung to their boots and mired their wheels, slowly began to harden. The deep ruts in the roads turned to solid ridges of stone-like clay. The shallow puddles glazed over, becoming dark, fragile mirrors reflecting the pale winter moon. The world was locking its doors, pulling a vast, brittle sheet of ice over the scarred landscape, and wrapping the weary army in a profound and breathless cold. For the young men huddled in the forests and fields, the onset of this bitter winter changed everything. The universe shrank once more, pulling tightly around their shivering shoulders. The dampness that had seeped into their heavy wool coats now froze, turning their uniforms into stiff, heavy armor that resisted every movement. The canvas of their small pup tents, soaked by weeks of rain, froze solid as wooden boards, offering no warmth, only a fragile windbreak against the biting air. In this frozen world, the grand machinery of the war seemed to fall into a quiet slumber. The thick grease in the engine stiffened, and the heavy metal of the trucks and tanks became dangerous to touch with a bare hand. The loud, rushing heartbeat of the advance was entirely silenced, replaced by a deep, beautiful, and terrifying stillness. Sound traveled differently in the freezing air. The sharp, dry crack of a breaking branch echoed for miles. The crunch of a single boot breaking through the frosted crust of the earth sounded as loud as a falling tree. Because of this, the men learned to move with a slow, deliberate grace, navigating their frozen camps like quiet ghosts walking on glass. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the true test of their endurance began. The twilight was painfully brief, a beautiful, fleeting wash of pale bruised purple and cold, dusty rose that quickly surrendered to the absolute blackness of a winter night. And with the dark, the temperature plummeted, slipping down into depths these boys had never known. This was the hour of the night watch. A young soldier, pulled from the shallow, shared warmth of a foxhole, would step out into the freezing expanse. He moved to the edge of the tree line, his heavy boots crunching softly against the frost. He pulled his woolen collar high around his ears, wrapping a rough, knitted scarf completely over his nose and mouth, leaving only his tired, watering eyes exposed to the wind. He stepped into a small, dug-out hollow, leaning his back against the frozen earth, and began his silent vigil. The loneliness of the night watch in the dead of winter was an immense, physical weight. There was no enemy to be seen, only the vast, silver-draped geometry of the sleeping forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their bark dusted with a fine, glittering powder of frost. The moonlight cast long, haunting shadows across the snowless, frozen ground. In this total isolation, the mind became both a refuge and a torment. He stood perfectly still, listening to the overwhelming silence. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic rush of his own breathing. With every exhale, his breath turned to a thick plume of white frost, curling into the moonlight before vanishing into the dark. It was a beautiful, melancholic reminder of his own fragile life, a tiny, warm spark burning stubbornly in the center of an indifferent, freezing world. He watched the frost gather on his eyelashes, feeling the tiny, sharp crystals forming on the wool of his scarf. To stay awake, to keep the numbing, seductive pull of sleep at bay, he had to keep his mind moving. He could not stamp his feet, for the noise would carry. He could not rub his hands together too vigorously, for the friction was lost through the thick, stiff leather of his gloves. So, he danced in his memories. He closed his eyes for just a fraction of a second, transporting himself away from the silver forest. He imagined the heavy, ornate iron radiator in the hallway of his childhood home. He could vividly hear the clank and hiss of the steam rising through the pipes on a January morning. He pictured the way his mother would lay his woolen mittens across the hot metal to dry after a snowball fight, remembering the exact, comforting smell of damp, warming wool. He focused entirely on that invisible heat, trying to draw it across the ocean, trying to pull the warmth from a memory and wrap it around his freezing hands. He thought of the golden, square glow of the windows on his street, shining out into the snow. He thought of the heavy, quilted blankets piled high on his bed, the kind of weight that made you feel entirely safe and anchored to the earth. He clung to these images with a quiet, desperate love. They were his lifeline. He stood in the freezing dark, guarding the sleep of his brothers, sustained by nothing more than the memory of a warm kitchen and a brightly lit parlor. Below the ground, in the shallow, hard-carved foxholes, the rest of the men fought their own quiet battles against the frost. The earth, which had once cradled them, was now a literal icebox, leaching the heat from their exhausted bodies. Survival became an act of profound, shared intimacy. Two soldiers, strangers just months before, would lie pressed together as tightly as humanly possible. They lay back to back, or spooned together beneath the stiff, frozen canvas of their shelter halves, sharing every single ounce of their collective body heat. There was no space for pride or personal boundaries in the freezing dark. There was only the vital, unspoken understanding that they needed each other to see the dawn. They layered their damp, heavy coats over themselves, pulling their knees to their chests to conserve warmth. When one man began to shiver uncontrollably, his teeth chattering with a violent, rhythmic click, the other would quietly unbutton his own coat, wrapping an arm around his brother, offering the heat of his own chest to calm the trembling. It was a pure, beautiful expression of humanity. In a world stripped of all comfort, they became each other's shelter. The small, everyday acts of life became monumental struggles of endurance. A soldier waking with a throat as dry as dust would reach for his metal canteen, only to find it frozen solid, a heavy block of ice in a canvas pouch. He would slip the freezing metal inside his coat, resting it against his ribs, enduring the biting chill against his skin just to thaw a few precious drops of water to share with his tent mate. They could not build fires. The bright, dancing flames would be a beacon in the dark, and the smoke would hang heavy in the still winter air. They lived entirely in the shadows, navigating the darkness by touch and by the soft, whispered voices of the men around them. Writing letters was nearly impossible. Their hands were too stiff, their knuckles raw and cracked, the joints refusing to bend around the thin wood of a pencil. The ink in their pens had long since frozen into solid, useless blue glass. So, they wrote their letters in the dark theaters of their minds. Lying in the freezing dirt, staring up at the frost-covered canvas, a boy from the gentle, rolling hills of the South would compose a letter to his wife. "My dearest," he would whisper silently to the night, "the stars here are entirely cold. They look like shattered glass scattered across the black. But when I close my eyes, I can see the warm yellow light of our porch lamp. I can hear the floorboards creaking under your steps. I am so cold, my love, but the thought of you is a fire I keep burning right in the center of my chest. Do not worry for me. The boys and I are looking out for each other. We will wait out the ice." He folded this invisible letter, sealing it with a silent prayer, and tucked it deeply away in his heart, keeping it safe until his hands were warm enough to put it to paper. The night stretched on for what felt like years. Every hour was a physical wait, a slow, agonizing crawl through the dark. The cold tried to seep into their minds, tried to convince them to simply close their eyes and let the numbing, painless sleep take over. But they did not give in. They drew upon a reservoir of quiet, fragile strength that they never knew they possessed. They survived by listening to the breathing of the man next to them, taking comfort in the simple, beautiful fact that they were not alone. They survived by promising themselves that the sun must eventually rise. And slowly, mercifully, the long night would begin to break. It started as a subtle shift in the absolute blackness, a faint, bruised lightning on the eastern horizon. The stars would begin to fade, one by one, retreating before the slow, creeping tide of morning. The deep purple sky softened into a pale, milky gray, illuminating the frozen, silver landscape. The sun did not bring heat. It was a pale, distant, white disk hanging low in the winter sky, offering light but no warmth. Yet, its arrival was a profound, daily miracle. As the first weak rays filtered through the frosted branches, touching the stiff canvas of the tents and the pale faces of the exhausted sentries, a collective, silent sigh of relief rippled through the frozen woods. They had done it. They had endured another night. Men slowly emerged from their icy burrows, their movements stiff and slow. They slapped their arms against their sides, their breath pluming in the pale light. They looked at each other with red-rimmed eyes, their faces pale and drawn, but offering soft, exhausted smiles. There were no cheers, no grand celebrations of the morning. There was only the quiet, profound nod of shared survival. A canteen was passed. A frozen ration biscuit was broken in two and shared. They stood together in the glittering, silver forest, watching the frost catch the morning light like millions of tiny diamonds scattered across the earth. The winter had arrived, wrapping them in its bitter, unforgiving embrace, but as they stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing dawn, they knew that their quiet, enduring human warmth was a fire the ice could never extinguish. A single whisper in the frozen dark was all it took to turn 100,000 men away from the rising sun. The night had settled over the icy hills with a heavy, crushing stillness. For weeks, the men had been slowly, agonizingly carving their lives into the frozen earth, facing eastward, their eyes fixed on the distant, invisible heart of the continent. They had finally built a fragile, shivering routine in the bitter cold. They knew exactly how many pine boughs it took to keep the frost from seeping through their wool blankets. They knew exactly how to angle their stiff canvas tents to block the biting wind that swept down through the valleys. They had accepted this frozen stillness, resigning themselves to a slow, grinding winter. And then, in the deepest, most quiet hour of the night, the order came. It did not arrive with the dramatic blare of a bugle or the loud, echoing shouts of officers. That would have shattered the delicate, terrifying peace of the winter woods. Instead, the command moved like a soft, invisible ripple across a dark pond. It was carried by a solitary runner slipping through the trees, his boots crunching softly against the crusted snow. It was passed down from a radio operator, his fingers stiff and blue, gently shaking the shoulder of a sleeping sergeant. A hand reached down into the pitch-black depths of a foxhole, gently tapping a heavy, wool-covered shoulder. "Wake up," a voice whispered, the words arriving on a cloud of white vapor. "Pack your gear. We are moving." The suddenness of it was entirely bewildering. A young soldier, pulled from the shallow, dreamless depths of exhaustion, blinked up at the sliver of starry sky visible through the trees. His mind was thick with sleep in the numbing cold. He had fallen asleep facing the east, anticipating another day of staring at the same unyielding ridge of ancient stone. Now, he was being told to stand up, to undo the tiny fraction of comfort he had managed to build, and to walk away into the dark. Where were they going? The whisper moved down the line, passed from shivering lip to shivering ear. Not east. Not forward into the dawn. North. They were turning north. There was a profound, quiet confusion as the men slowly emerged from the earth like ghosts rising from the snow. The compass needle, which had pointed them so steadily toward the end of the war, was suddenly swinging wildly in the dark. They did not know the grand, sweeping strategies being drawn on maps in warm rooms hundreds of miles away. They did not know the vast, terrifying scale of the storm that had broken over the distant forests of the Ardennes. All they knew was the heavy, reluctant ache in their bones, and the immediate, staggering task of packing their frozen lives into canvas bags. In the pitch black, the woods came alive with the muffled, rustling sounds of an army quietly disassembling itself. The damp canvas of their pup tents had frozen solid in the night, becoming as stiff and brittle as sheets of thin metal. As the men tried to fold them, the fabric cracked and popped, a sharp sound they desperately tried to muffle against their heavy coats. Their fingers, thick with the cold and encased in worn leather gloves, fumbled clumsily with the metal buckles of their heavy packs. It was a deeply personal, quiet struggle. A boy from a warm, sunlit valley in California knelt in the snow, trying to untie the frozen hemp rope that held his bedroll together. His hands shook, refusing to obey his commands. He closed his eyes, taking a slow, trembling breath, fighting down a sudden, overwhelming wave of simple, childlike frustration. He did not want to be brave right now. He just wanted his hands to be warm enough to tie a knot. Beside him, an older soldier, a man who had been a quiet, steady carpenter before the world broke apart, saw the boy's silent struggle. Without a word, he set down his own rifle, knelt in the snow, and reached out with his own worn, steady hands. Together, in the freezing dark, they worked the stubborn knot free. They shared a brief, unseen look in the blackness, profound acknowledgement of the shared misery and the enduring, quiet love that kept them moving. As they packed, they carefully tucked away the fragile pieces of their hearts. A letter, half written by the dim glow of a shielded match hours before, was gently folded and slid deep into an inner breast pocket, pressed safely against a beating heart. A small, slightly dented tin of peppermints, saved for a moment when the homesickness became too heavy to bear, was wrapped in a dry sock and stowed away. These tiny, beautiful anchors to the world beyond the woods were guarded more fiercely than their ammunition. As the gear was slung over weary shoulders, the true reason for this sudden, silent pivot began to filter through the ranks. It came not as a grand announcement, but as a low, solemn murmur passed between the frozen trees. There were boys trapped up north. Other soldiers, boys who wore the same green wool, who carried the same worn photographs in their pockets, who dreamed of the same quiet porches and warm kitchens, were surrounded in the deep snow. The enemy had broken through, a massive, terrifying wave of steel and winter, and those boys were holding the line alone in the dark. As this realization settled over the frozen woods, the mood shifted. The quiet, exhausted grumbling faded away, replaced by a sudden, breathtaking stillness. The confusion melted into a deep, unwavering resolve. The men stopped looking back at the empty, shallow holes they were leaving behind. They turned their faces toward the north. They did not think of themselves as saviors. They were simply brothers, bound by a silent, unbreakable pact forged in the dust of summer and the mud of autumn. If someone was trapped in the cold, you went to them. You packed your frozen tent, you slung your heavy rifle over your shoulder, and you walked into the dark. It was the simplest, most profound form of everyday heroism, the quiet willingness to set aside your own profound suffering for the sake of a stranger who needed you. Down on the icy, hardened roads, the massive steel machines were waking up. The drivers, their faces pale and drawn beneath their padded leather helmets, climbed into the freezing cabs of the great trucks and the heavy, sloped bellies of the tanks. The engines, stiff and protesting against the bitter cold, coughed and sputtered, breaking the silence of the night with a low, mechanical growl. The smell of raw diesel exhaust bloomed in the crisp air, mixing with the scent of pine and frost. Slowly, the dim, red taillights flickered on, painting the snow with a soft, bruised glow. They formed a long, winding river of embers stretching out into the absolute blackness, a mesmerizing ribbon of light pointing the way toward the unknown. The infantrymen emerged from the tree line, their breaths pluming in the pale light of the moon. They climbed into the open backs of the waiting transport trucks, packing in tightly, shoulder to shoulder, seeking whatever fragile warmth they could share. They pulled their heavy woolen blankets over their heads, turning themselves into shapeless, silent mounds in the dark. As the massive convoy finally lurched forward, the heavy tires crunching over the iced, rutted roads, the men felt a strange, soothing relief wash over them. The agonizing anticipation of the packing was over. They were moving again. The great, rolling rhythm of the trucks took over, a deep, vibrating lullaby that sank into their weary bones. The biting wind whipped through the open canvas, but tucked deeply against one another, they found a way to endure it. A weary medic leaned his head gently against the shoulder of a quiet rifleman, closing his eyes as the truck swayed over the uneven road. The rifleman did not pull away, he simply adjusted his weight to make the medic more comfortable, staring out into the dark, watching the frozen trees blur past. They did not know what awaited them at the end of this sudden, desperate journey. They knew only that the compass had turned, pulling them away from the slow, grinding siege and launching them into a terrifying race against time and the freezing elements. Yet, beneath the fear and the overwhelming exhaustion, there was a beautiful, quiet peace to be found in the movement. They were entirely surrendered to the momentum of the great army. They did not have to make decisions, they only had to hold on. As the hours stretched into the deep, echoing void of the winter night, the trucks rolled endlessly onward. The sky above them remained a vast, indifferent canopy of cold, glittering stars. But down on the earth, winding through the frozen valleys and the sleeping forests, a profound warmth was moving. It was not the heat of the sun or the glow of a fire. It was the burning, stubborn light of thousands of young men, leaving their own comfort behind, racing into the darkest part of the winter to stand beside their brothers. They let the hypnotic hum of the engines carry them away, their minds drifting back to the warm, softly lit rooms of their memories. They dreamed of the peace that must surely be waiting for them somewhere beyond the snow, completely trusting the road, trusting the men driving in the dark, and trusting the silent, unwavering compass of their own gentle hearts, pointing them steadily, resolutely, into the north. The world had vanished, leaving behind only an endless ocean of perfect, silent white. The trucks could go no further. The great, roaring engines that had carried them through the autumn mud and over the frozen ruts of the early winter were finally defeated by the profound, drifting depths of the Ardennes snow. The men had to climb down from the relative shelter of the canvas-covered beds, their heavy boots sinking deep into the powdery drifts. As the engines were cut, a vast and sweeping silence rushed in to fill the void. It was not a terrifying silence, but rather a heavy, insulated quiet. The snow was falling so thickly that it seemed to absorb all the noise of the world, dampening the clatter of gear and the murmur of voices, reducing the grand movement of an entire army to a soft, rhythmic, and hypnotic crunch. They formed long, winding lines that stretched out across the blinding white landscape, a fragile thread of olive drab weaving through a sleeping, frozen forest. The towering pine trees bowed low, their branches heavy with thick, sparkling blankets of snow. It looked like a landscape pulled from the pages of a forgotten winter fairy tale, breathtakingly beautiful and entirely indifferent to the weary boys who walked beneath its canopy. Every step was a quiet, agonizing negotiation with the earth. Their heavy leather boots, completely soaked by the earlier rains and the melting snow of the days before, had now frozen solid. The leather was as stiff and unyielding as iron, trapping their numb, aching feet in icy cages. Lifting a leg required a conscious, deliberate effort, pulling the heavy boot free from the deep drift, carrying it forward through the biting air, and pressing it down again into the unbroken crust. Yet, they found a rhythm. It was a slow, swaying, mesmerizing cadence. The man at the very front of the line acted as a snowplow, his body breaking the trail, pushing through drifts that sometimes reached as high as his waist. It was an exhausting, selfless task. When he could push no longer, when his chest heaved and his legs trembled, he would simply step softly to the side, allowing the next man in line to take his place, seamlessly trading the burden of the unbroken path. The men behind had only to follow the footprints. They kept their heads bowed against the swirling flakes, their eyes fixed entirely on the boots of the man directly in front of them. They stepped exactly where he stepped, placing their frozen feet into the deep, dark indentations left in the snow. It became a moving meditation. Step, pause. Step, pause. They were tethered to one another by these hollow footprints, a physical chain of trust and shared endurance. If the man ahead stumbled, the man behind would instinctively reach out a heavy, gloved hand, catching him by the canvas webbing of his pack, holding him steady until he found his balance again. No words were needed. The grip of a hand in the swirling white was a complete and beautiful sentence, saying simply, "I have you. We keep going." The cold was no longer just a temperature, it was a physical presence that walked beside them. It slipped beneath their collars and bit at their raw, wind-burned cheeks. Frost gathered thick and white on their eyebrows, and their breath plumed in the air like steam from a quiet engine. They wrapped their woolen scarves so tightly around their faces that only their tired, watering eyes remained visible. In this blinding, freezing void, the mind desperately sought an escape. As their bodies moved automatically through the drifts, their thoughts took flight, traveling far away from the frozen forests of Europe. A young rifleman from the rolling farm country of the Midwest closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the steady crunch of his boots transport him. He remembered the soft, gentle snows of his childhood, the kind that fell lightly on a Sunday morning, covering the front yard in a pristine, welcoming blanket. He could almost feel the smooth, worn wood of his old sled beneath his mittens. He remembered the breathless thrill of flying down the small hill behind his house, the air sharp and clear, filled with the ringing laughter of his brothers. He held onto that memory tightly, using it to build a small, invisible fire in the center of his chest. He imagined his mother standing on the back porch, wiping her hands on her apron, calling them inside. He could vividly smell the sweet, rich aroma of hot cocoa simmering on the stove, and feel the heavy, comforting weight of a patchwork quilt wrapped around his shivering shoulders. The memory was so beautiful, so incredibly vivid, that for a few precious miles, he entirely forgot the agonizing ache in his toes. He walked through the blizzard wrapped in the warm, enduring love of his distant home. There were boys who had grown up in a world of soft beds and warm hearths, now asked to perform a miracle of endurance. But they did not walk for glory. They walked because of a profound, unspoken promise that pulsed in time with their beating hearts. Somewhere ahead of them, hidden entirely by the blinding white horizon, was a small, ancient crossroads town. And in that town, surrounded by the ice and the dark, their brothers were trapped. They did not know the names of the men holding the lion and baston. They did not know what they looked like, or what towns they hailed from. But they knew they wore the same uniform, carried the same worn photographs of sweethearts in their breast pockets, and shivered under the exact same indifferent, freezing sky. The thought of those trapped boys, hungry, low on ammunition, waiting in the terrifying dark, was a physical pull, stronger than gravity, stronger than the freezing wind. It was empathy in its purest, most heroic form. When a soldier's legs threatened to give out, when the numbing, seductive whisper of the cold told him to just lie down in the soft drift and close his eyes, he thought of the men waiting in the town. He pictured a brother huddled in a frozen foxhole, searching the empty white horizon for a friendly face. The soldier would blink away the frost from his eyelashes, swallow the dry ache in his throat, and force his heavy leg to take one more step. He could not stop. To stop was to abandon a brother in the dark, and that was a cold far worse than the winter. The quiet, everyday heroism of this march was not found in grand speeches or raised banners. It was found in the breathtaking tenderness these weary men showed to one another. When the long, winding column would briefly halt to let the men catch their breath, there was no sitting down. To sit in the deep snow was to risk never getting back up. Instead, they leaned heavily against the trunks of the great pine trees, or simply leaned against each other, standing back to back in the swirling snow to block the biting wind. A medic, whose own hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, would quietly move down the line. He carried a small metal canteen tucked deep inside his coat, pressed against his own skin to keep the water from freezing solid. He would approach a young soldier who was shivering so violently his teeth chattered like castanets. The medic would gently pull the scarf down from the boy's mouth, unscrew the cap with stiff fingers, and offer a tiny, precious sip of the lukewarm water. It was a holy communion in the snow. The boy would swallow, looking at the medic with eyes wide with exhaustion and gratitude, and the medic would simply nod, offering a soft, tired smile before moving to the next shivering silhouette. In their pockets, the letters from home had grown damp and fragile, the ink beginning to bleed into the soft paper. They did not dare take them out in the blizzard, fearing the wind would snatch them away or the snow would dissolve them completely. Instead, they simply rested their gloved hands over the pockets where the letters lived. They pressed the words against their hearts, feeling the physical shape of the paper. They drew an imaginary line from the freezing forest, across the dark, rolling ocean, directly to the warm hands that had penned those words. The love written on those pages was a shield that the winter could not pierce. As the short, gray afternoon began to fade, the light retreated from the sky. The bright, blinding white of the snow shifted to a soft, melancholic lavender, and then deepened into a rich, bruised purple. The twilight in the Ardennes was quiet and fast, swallowing the trees and blurring the edges of the world. The wind began to die down, leaving the forest perfectly, breathtakingly still. The snowflakes grew larger, falling gently and silently from the darkening sky, resting softly on their helmets and shoulders like a delicate, lacy shroud. The column did not stop. They had to keep moving, a slow, continuous river of men flowing through the night. As complete darkness fell, the stars appeared, cold and sharp, glittering like shattered glass scattered across the velvet sky. The snow on the ground caught the pale starlight, glowing with a soft, ethereal luminescence that guided their weary feet. They became a line of silent shadows, their heavy breathing the only sound in the vast, sleeping world. The rhythmic crunch of their boots became a soothing, repetitive lullaby. It was a sound of unwavering loyalty, a sound that said, "We are coming." In the freezing dark, the fear and the pain began to melt away, replaced by a deep, transcendent peace. They were completely surrendered to the march, their bodies moving on instinct, their souls anchored by their quiet love for one another. They were no longer just an army, they were a single, living organism, breathing together, stepping together, enduring together. A boy from the warm, sunlit coast of California looked up at the unfamiliar, icy stars. He could not feel his toes, and his fingers were numb, but as he watched the back of the man in front of him, swaying gently with every step, he felt a profound, overwhelming warmth flood his chest. He was a part of something beautiful, something deeply and quietly magnificent. He lowered his head, finding the deep, dark footprint in the snow, and stepped into it. The gentle, steady rhythm of the footfalls carried them onward, rocking them through the frozen night. They walked through the deep snow, carrying the light of their homes and the stubborn, beautiful warmth of their brotherhood, moving ever closer to the town in the dark, held safe and steady in the soothing, quiet embrace of the winter night. Out of the heavy, frozen fog, the shadows slowly began to take the shape of brothers. For what felt like an eternity, the men holding the line had lived entirely inside a cloud of ice. The ancient, snow-draped forests that surrounded their small, battered town had become a quiet, frozen island, cut off from the rest of the world by a vast and indifferent winter. The air was so still, and the mist so thick, that a man could barely see the face of the friend huddled in the foxhole right beside him. They had existed in a state of suspended breath, their world reduced to the few feet of frosted earth they were sworn to protect, and the deep, aching cold that had settled into their very bones. They had run out of almost everything a soldier relies upon. The heavy canvas supply bags were empty, resting flat and useless against the snow. The medicines had all been carefully, desperately portioned out days ago. Even the simplest comforts, a dry pair of socks, a warm cup of coffee, the flare of a match to light a precious, hoarded cigarette, had become nothing more than beautiful, distant memories. But they had not run out of hope, and they had not run out of love for one another. In the dim, candle-lit cellars beneath the ruined stone houses of the town, the wounded lay shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in every spare blanket and heavy winter coat their brothers could find. A young medic, his own face pale with exhaustion, moved softly among them in the shadows. His medical kit was completely empty, stripped bare of bandages and bombs, but he did not stop his rounds. He knew that when the medicine is gone, the only thing left to offer is the profound, healing warmth of the human spirit. He would kneel beside a shivering boy from the golden plains of the Midwest, gently taking the soldier's trembling, frostbitten hand in his own. He would lean in close, his voice a soft, soothing whisper in the dark, and talk about the coming spring. He spoke of how the snow would eventually melt, how the green grass would push through the heavy earth, and how they would all sit under the warm, forgiving sun once again. He held the boy's hand until the trembling stopped, offering his own quiet strength, a silent anchor in the freezing tide. Out on the perimeter, in the deep, blue-white drifts of the forest, the defenders leaned against the trunks of the great pine trees, their eyes heavy with a sleep they dared not take. They were boys who had grown old in the span of a few winter days. They survived by sharing the invisible warmth of their memories. Two soldiers, sharing a single, stiffened wool blanket, would pass the hours by reciting the contents of the letters they carried in their breast pockets. They knew the words by heart now, having read them over and over until the ink had blurred. They spoke of front porch swings, of mothers humming in warm kitchens, of dogs waiting patiently by screen doors. These stories were a fragile, beautiful fire they kept burning in the dark, a promise to themselves that there was a gentle world still waiting for them to return. And then, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift moved through the frozen air. It was not the sharp, terrifying crack of battle, nor the sudden, dramatic sweep of a rising curtain. It began merely as a low, deep vibration, a hum that seemed to travel up through the solid ice of the earth itself. The men in the foxholes paused, their breath catching in their throats, their tired eyes straining against the thick, swirling mist. They tilted their heads, listening with a desperate, quiet intensity. The sound grew, very slowly, from a vibration into a steady, rhythmic thrum. It was a mechanical heartbeat, heavy and slow, accompanied by the distinct, soft crunch of heavy tracks and boots breaking through the crusted snow. It was a sound coming from the south. Nobody dared to speak. They simply gripped the edges of their frozen coats, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The mist, which had been an impenetrable wall of gray and white for so long, slowly began to thin, turning a pale, luminescent milky color as the morning light tried to break through. Through this glowing fog, a shape began to form. At first, it was just a darker smudge against the white, a phantom moving slowly through the trees. But as it drew closer, the lines sharpened. The massive, sloped steel of a tank appeared, its olive-drab paint completely covered in a thick layer of white frost, making it look like a great, sleeping beast of the winter woods. And walking beside it, emerging one by one from the vapor, were the men. They were covered in snow, their heavy green overcoats hanging low and stiff with ice. Their faces were hidden behind thick woolen scarves, their shoulders hunched against the wind. But as they stepped into the clearing, breaking the invisible, terrifying line of the siege, the scarves were pulled down. For a long, breathtaking moment, time simply stopped. The weary defenders, rising slowly from their snow-filled trenches, looked at the faces of the men who had walked through the blizzard to find them. And the rescuers, their legs trembling from the agonizing, endless march, looked back at the brothers they had come to save. There were no cheers. There were no grand, sweeping salutes. The relief was far too deep, far too profound for noise. Instead, there was a beautiful, overwhelming wave of quiet emotion that washed over the frozen forest. A defender, his face smudged with soot and lined with unimaginable exhaustion, took a single, hesitant step forward. His legs gave way, the sudden realization of safety dissolving the adrenaline that had kept him standing for days. But before he could fall into the snow, a rescuer was there. The boy who had marched through the night dropped his heavy rifle, rushed forward, and caught him. They held onto each other in the deep snow, two boys from different corners of a distant country, wrapped in a tight, silent embrace. The rescuer closed his eyes, burying his face in the shoulder of the man he had saved, feeling a hot, sudden tear slip down his own wind-burned cheek, freezing instantly in the cold air. The defender clung to the heavy canvas of his brother's coat, burying his face in the rough wool, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of a heavy, terrible burden finally being set down. All along the tree line, this quiet, tearful communion was taking place. The narrow path of light had finally reached them, piercing the heart of the winter darkness. The rescuers immediately began to unburden themselves. They shrugged off their heavy canvas packs, their numb, clumsy fingers racing to unbuckle the frozen leather straps. They reached deep inside, pulling out the small, precious treasures they had hoarded and carried through the storm. A boy from a sunny coastal town pulled off his thick, dry woolen gloves and gently pressed them into the bare, blue, and shaking hands of a young sentry. Another soldier retrieved a slightly dented tin of rations, opening it with a quiet scrape of metal, and handed it to a man whose eyes widened at the simple, miraculous sight of food. In the center of the clearing, two soldiers stood facing each other. One pulled a small, waxed paper booklet of matches from his inner pocket. He struck it, carefully cupping the tiny, brilliant orange flame against the wind. He offered it to the defender, lighting the cigarette the man had held unlit between his lips for 3 days. The flare of the match illuminated both their faces in the gray light, one face drawn and hollow from the waiting, the other withered and strained from the marching. They locked eyes over the tiny flame, and a soft, exhausted smile passed between them. It was a smile that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgment of the quiet, enduring heroism they had both displayed. Down in the cellars, the news arrived not with a shout, but with the soft, gentle opening of a heavy wooden door. A sliver of pale, winter sunlight fell across the stone floor. The young medic looked up, his eyes meeting the gaze of a new soldier stepping down into the shadows, his arms full of heavy wool blankets and fresh bandages. The medic did not say a word. He simply lowered his head, pressing his hands to his face, and wept silently in the dark, overwhelmed by the beautiful, sudden reality of grace. The terrible, suffocating weight of isolation had been broken. The town was no longer a lonely island in the ice. It was connected once again to the grand, beating heart of the army, and to the warm, distant world beyond the ocean. The men who had held the line did not have to stare out into the blinding white anymore. They did not have to jump at the sound of a falling branch, or try to force their frozen eyes to stay open. The men who had marched through the snow quietly stepped past them, moving to the edge of the forest to take up the watch. "We have it from here," a young rescuer whispered gently, placing a steady, reassuring hand on the shoulder of an exhausted defender. "Go rest. We are here." The defenders slowly retreated from the line. They moved back toward the ruined buildings, their steps slow and heavy, but no longer burdened by the crushing fear of the unknown. They found corners in the cellars, or quiet spots against the inner walls of the stone churches, and they laid themselves down. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they reached into their pockets and pulled out their letters from home, not just to survive the night, but to actually believe in them. They looked at the blurred ink, at the names of the people they loved, and they knew, with a quiet, shining certainty, that they would see those faces again. They would feel the warmth of a summer breeze. They would sit on those front porches. The narrow path of light had guided them back to life. As the pale winter sun climbed a little higher, casting long, soft shadows across the snow, a profound and soothing peace settled over the town. The great, quiet forest stood watch around them, but the fear was gone, replaced by the enduring, beautiful warmth of brotherhood. The weary boys wrapped themselves in the newly arrived blankets, closing their tired eyes. They listened to the soft, steady crunch of their brothers' boots pacing the perimeter, the most comforting lullaby in the world. Safe, rescued, and surrounded by the quiet love of the men who had carried the light through the dark, they finally let go. They drifted down into a deep, dreamless, and gentle sleep, resting securely in the quiet, peaceful embrace of the winter morning. The great storm had finally exhausted its fury, leaving behind a world entirely swallowed by a silent, unbroken ocean of white. The relief of breaking the siege had been a profound, tearful dawn, a sudden burst of light in the deepest dark. But as the initial surge of overwhelming emotion slowly settled, the men looked around and realized that the winter had not retreated with the enemy. The war was far from over, and the coldest months of the year still stretched out before them like a vast, unmapped wilderness. The rescue had been a miracle, but now came the quiet, grueling reality of simply living in the ice. The landscape of the Ardennes had transformed into a surreal, frozen dream. The towering, ancient pine trees were bowed low, their branches heavily laden with thick, sparkling mantles of snow. In the pale, diffused light of the winter sun, the forest looked entirely made of glass and spun silver. The sky above was a seamless, pale pearl, bleeding perfectly into the snow-covered earth at the horizon, making it almost impossible to tell where the ground ended and the heavens began. It was a beautiful, terrifyingly silent world, a place that felt completely detached from the green and golden earth they had marched across in the summer. To move through this endless, brilliant white was an exercise in pure, agonizing endurance. The roads had vanished entirely, buried beneath drifts that sometimes rose higher than a man's chest. The great, heavy trucks and armored machines could only crawl at a breathless, grinding pace, leaving deep, dark trenches in their wake. And beside them, forced out into the trackless wilderness, the men walked. They moved like slow, weary phantoms. Their heavy green coats were crusted with a permanent layer of frost, the wool stiff and unyielding. The constant, repetitive motion of lifting a heavy, frozen boot, pushing it forward through the thick powder, and sinking it down again became their entire universe. The soft, rhythmic crunch of thousands of boots breaking the snow crust was the only sound in the deadened air. It was a hypnotic, mesmerizing cadence, a slow, swaying march through a dream from which they could not wake. In this beautiful, desolate void, the vibrant colors of their past lives began to feel like fading myths. The world was only white, gray, and the dark olive of their coats. To remind themselves that they were still human, that they still belonged to a world of warmth and color, they turned to the fragile treasures hidden deep within their pockets. When the long columns would finally halt, finding a brief, shivering respite in a clearing of the silent woods, the men would gently unbutton their heavy coats. With stiff, trembling fingers, they would reach into their inner breast pockets, pulling out small, leather wallets that had frozen solid. And from these wallets, they would retrieve their photographs. These small squares of paper were the most precious things they owned. They had been touched, held, and wept over so many times that the edges were soft and frayed, the glossy finish worn away to a dull, matte gray. A young man from a dusty, sun-baked town in the southwest leaned back against the trunk of a great pine, carefully slipping off his right glove. The cold air immediately bit at his pale skin, but he ignored it. He held a small, black and white photograph of his wife, standing on the front steps of their home, wearing a light summer dress, a bright, carefree smile on her face. He stared at the image, trying to pull himself through the paper and into that frozen moment in time. He traced the outline of her face with a numb, dirty thumb, feeling the worn crease where the picture had been folded. He looked at the grass at her feet, trying desperately to remember the exact, sweet smell of a freshly mowed lawn in July. He looked at the shadows cast by the afternoon sun, trying to feel that invisible heat against his freezing cheeks. The contrast between the bright, sunny world of the photograph and the blinding, freezing white of the forest was heartbreaking. Yet, looking at that fading image was the only thing that kept the ice from settling entirely into his heart. He held it close to his face, a silent, desperate prayer of love, drawing an invisible warmth from the paper. It was a small, personal fire that the winter could not extinguish. He would hold it until his hand grew too numb to feel the edges, and then, with profound reverence, he would carefully tuck the girl in the summer dress safely back against his chest. Survival in the long white winter was not about grand, sweeping gestures. It was about the microscopic, quiet details of everyday heroism. It was the absolute, unwavering reliance upon the man shivering next to you. When they tried to brew coffee, it was an agonizing, delicate process. A few men would gather around a tiny, smokeless heat tablet, using their own bodies as a windbreak. They would scoop the clean, powdery snow into a blackened metal helmet, watching it slowly melt into a few precious cups of tepid water. They would stir in the bitter, dark powder, the faint aroma of the coffee feeling like a sudden, glorious luxury in the sterile air. There was never enough to go around. But the cup was always passed. A soldier, his lips cracked and bleeding from the wind, would take a small, measured sip, holding the warm liquid in his mouth for just a second to savor it, before handing the battered tin cup to his brother. "You take the rest," he would whisper, his voice hoarse and soft. The receiving soldier would shake his head, taking only a sip himself, passing it further down the line. They nourished each other with these tiny, selfless acts. The coffee did not warm their bodies, but the act of sharing it warmed their souls. It was a quiet, stubborn declaration that the winter had not stripped them of their humanity. The days blurred together in an endless wash of white. The sun was merely a pale, distant smear behind the heavy clouds, offering no comfort and marking the passage of time only by a slight shifting of the gray light. As the afternoon would slowly bleed into evening, the temperature would plummet even further, the air turning so brittle and sharp it hurt to draw a breath. The landscape would shift from brilliant white to a soft, melancholic lavender, and then finally into a deep, crushing black. This was the hardest time. The time when the beautiful, terrifying quiet of the forest grew heavy. To keep the despair at bay, they wrote. They huddled in their shallow, snow-filled trenches, pulling a heavy canvas half-tent over their heads to block the falling flakes. By the faint, ghostly light of the moon reflecting off the snow, they pressed their stubby pencils to damp, wrinkling paper. They did not write about the sheer, mind-numbing endlessness of the drifts. They did not write about how the cold felt like a physical weight pressing against their chests. They wrote purely of the future. When I come home, a young farmer would write, shielding the paper with his hand as a stray snowflake drifted under the canvas, we are going to paint the barn that bright, cherry red you always wanted. And I am going to sit by the stove for a week straight, and I am going to watch you bake bread, and I am never going to let you out of my sight. They built grand, beautiful castles in the air, using their words to anchor themselves to a tomorrow they desperately needed to believe in. They folded the letters, sealing them with cold, trembling lips, and trusting their deepest, softest hopes to a world that currently offered them nothing but ice. As the deep night fully settled over the Ardennes, the army simply stopped moving. There was nowhere to go in the dark, and no energy left to get there. They dug small, coffin-sized holes into the snowdrifts, lining them with whatever pine branches they could snap from the trees. They lay down in pairs, clinging to one another beneath their stiff, frozen blankets. The shared body heat was the only thing standing between them and the eternal sleep of the cold. They wrapped their arms around each other, two boys from different lives, different towns, different worlds, now breathing in perfect unison in the freezing dark. They whispered to each other in the stillness, their voices barely carrying over the soft sigh of the wind. They talked about the fading photographs in their pockets. They described the faces of their mothers, the laughs of their sweethearts, the exact layout of the streets they had grown up on. They painted pictures with their words, filling the dark, frozen trench with the colorful, vibrant memories of home. And as the exhaustion finally pulled them down into the heavy, deep waters of sleep, the harsh reality of the long white winter slowly faded away. The blinding snow, the agonizing footfalls, the endless, freezing nights all dissolved. In their dreams, they were walking up those familiar front steps. They were opening the screen doors. They were stepping into the warm, golden light of their own kitchens, greeted by the sweet, enduring love they had carried across an ocean and through the deepest ice. Cradled in the frozen earth, watched over by the pale, cold stars, they slept. They were an army of quiet heroes, pushing through the endless drifts, sustained entirely by the fading paper in their pockets and the brilliant, unyielding warmth of their shared, beautiful humanity. The water moved with a heavy, ancient silence, a dark and sweeping ribbon dividing the world they knew from the final unknown. The long, bitter grip of the winter had finally begun to loosen its hold on the continent. The frozen earth had slowly softened, turning the frost-covered valleys into a landscape of damp, thawing soil and waking forests. The air had lost its biting, terrible edge, replaced now by a cool, heavy mist that smelled of wet pine needles, turning earth, and the deep, metallic scent of moving water. They stood together on the western bank, hidden within the deep shadows of the trees, looking out over the vast expanse of the great river. This was the Rhine. For months, it had been a word whispered in the dark, a distant line drawn on folded maps, a final, monumental threshold that stood between them and the end of their long, agonizing journey. Now, it was no longer an idea. It was a physical, breathing presence, a massive body of black water swirling and pulling just a few feet from their weary boots. There were no roaring engines tonight. The grand, heavy machinery of the army, the great steel tanks and the rumbling transport trucks, had been silenced. Tonight, the crossing belonged entirely to the soft, fragile humanity of the men. They were returning to the oldest, simplest way of moving across the earth. They would cross on the water, guided only by the strength of their own tired arms and the quiet, enduring trust they held for the brothers beside them. In the gathering dark, the preparations were made with an absolute, breathtaking quiet. The world was stripped of all noise. Thousands of men moved along the muddy banks with a slow, deliberate grace, their footfalls muffled by the soft earth. They spoke only in the faintest of whispers, leaning close to one another so that their breath barely stirred the cool night air. They prepared the small, flat-bottomed boats. They were fragile things, built of thin wood and canvas, seeming impossibly small against the wide, dark majesty of the river. To ensure their silent passage, the men took the heavy wooden paddles and carefully wrapped the blades in torn strips of burlap and soft cloth. They bound the fabric tightly, their numb fingers working in the dark, tying the knots with a gentle precision so that the wood would not clack against the sides of the boats. It was a quiet, meticulous act of care, a shared, silent promise to protect one another in the vulnerable open space of the water. A boy from a small river town in the American Midwest stood by the edge of the water, watching the dark current slip by. He knew rivers. He had grown up with the smell of river mud on his shoes and the sound of lapping water echoing through his open bedroom window. He remembered the long, lazy summer afternoons spent in a drifting rowboat with his father, the sun warm on his shoulders, the only sound the gentle hum of dragonflies and the soft plop of a fishing line breaking the surface. But this river was different. It felt impossibly old, holding centuries of secrets in its deep, black currents. He reached down, slowly removing his worn leather glove, and dipped his bare fingers into the water. It was startlingly cold, sending a sudden, sharp shiver up his arm. He closed his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath of the misty air. He let the memory of his quiet river back home wash over him, using that warm, golden image to calm the rapid, nervous beating of his heart. He drew strength from the water, reminding himself that beneath the darkness, a river is just a river, and he knew how to cross it. The signal to move did not come with a shout. It was simply a gentle touch on the shoulder, passed down the line from man to man. Slowly, carefully, they stepped out of the shadows and down the slippery bank. They climbed into the small boats, their heavy boots finding the flat wooden floorboards. The boats swayed and dipped under their combined weight, the dark water rising dangerously close to the canvas edges. They sat shoulder to shoulder, packed tightly together in the small space, their knees touching, their breaths rising in unison in the cool air. With a soft, muffled push against the muddy bank, the boats slipped away from the shore. The moment they left the solid earth, a profound and terrifying vulnerability settled over them. They were entirely exposed, floating on a dark mirror under a vast, starless sky. The current caught them immediately, a silent, powerful hand pulling at the bottom of the fragile boats, attempting to turn them down the river. To fight the current, they began to paddle. The cloth-wrapped oars dipped into the black water with a soft, hypnotic rhythm. Swish. Pull. Swish. Pull. It sounded like the steady, gentle breathing of a sleeping giant. The water parted quietly around the wooden bows, sending delicate, silver ripples spreading out into the darkness. Every man in the boat moved in perfect, unspoken harmony. If one side pulled too hard, the boat would turn. If they pulled too softly, the current would take them. They had to feel the water, and feel the rhythm of the men beside them. It was a beautiful, desperate ballet performed in pitch blackness. As they reached the center of the great river, the mist grew thicker, swallowing the banks on either side. They were suspended in an endless, floating void. There was no earth, no sky, only the boat, the cold air, and the dark water. A sudden, chilling spray of water crested the side of the boat, splashing against the face of a young soldier near the bow. He gasped softly, his hands gripping the wooden bench so tightly his knuckles turned white beneath the dust. The fear was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to draw a breath. He was terrified of the dark, terrifying depths beneath him, terrified of the silence, terrified that they would never reach the other side. The older soldier sitting next to him felt the sudden, rigid tension in the boy's shoulders. Without missing a stroke of his paddle, the older man leaned over just a fraction. He shifted his weight, pressing his own warm, heavy shoulder firmly against the boy's trembling arm. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That solid, physical contact was an anchor dropped into a stormy sea. It was a silent, beautiful reassurance that said, I am here. I am with you. We are going to make it across. The young boy closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath, and the trembling slowly began to fade. He leaned back into his brother's shoulder, finding his courage in the quiet warmth of that shared touch. In the profound silence of the crossing, the men retreated entirely into the sanctuaries of their own minds. To keep from looking down into the black water, they looked inward. Deep within their damp wool coats, tucked safely into waterproof pouches, rested their letters from home. The paper was worn, the ink faded from the damp, but the words carried a profound, luminous power. A young husband closed his eyes and vividly imagined the last letter he had received from his wife. He pictured her sitting at the small wooden table in their kitchen, the soft, yellow light of the lamp catching the stray hairs falling across her cheek. She had written about planting the spring garden, about turning the soil and waiting for the first green shoots to appear. He clung to that image of life, of growth, of peace. As he pulled his heavy paddle through the dark, cold water of the Rhine, he was simultaneously walking through the warm, sunlit rows of that imaginary garden. He used her love as a shield against the creeping cold and the terrifying unknown. He was crossing this dark river precisely so he could walk in that garden again. The thought filled him with a quiet, unyielding resolve. The journey seemed to stretch on for an eternity, a suspended moment in time where only the rhythmic dipping of the oars existed. The physical exertion was immense, their shoulders burning, their hands blistering beneath their wet gloves, but they did not stop. They pushed through the pain, fueled entirely by the collective heartbeat of the men in the boat. And then, through the thick, swirling mist, a darker shape began to materialize. It was a slow, subtle change in the shadows. The endless void of the river gave way to the solid, looming silhouette of the eastern bank. The water beneath them grew shallower, the current slowing its relentless pull. With a soft, gentle thud, the bow of the wooden boat struck the muddy shore. It was the quietest, most profound sound they had ever heard. The boat slid forward a few feet, the bottom scraping softly against the submerged rocks, and then came to a complete, beautiful stop. They had crossed. The men did not leap from the boats. They moved slowly, their legs stiff and shaking from the tension and the cold. They stepped over the side, their heavy boots sinking into the soft, wet mud of the far shore. The cold river water immediately rushed over their boots, soaking their tired feet, but they hardly noticed. The earth was solid beneath them. As they waded up the bank, disappearing into the dark line of the trees, a collective, silent sigh rippled through the ranks. It was the sound of 1,000 men finally letting out the breath they had been holding since they left the western shore. The terrible, crushing weight of the anticipation dissolved, leaving behind a profound, sweeping exhaustion and a deep, quiet gratitude. They gathered in the shadowed woods, sitting on the damp earth, leaning their weary backs against the trunks of the trees. They were soaked, shivering in the cool night air, but they were together, and they were safe on the other side. A soldier reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, slightly damp rag. He turned to the man beside him, a boy whose face was still dripping with the cold spray of the river, and gently offered the cloth. The boy took it with a soft, whispered word of thanks, wiping the river from his eyes. It was a tiny, magnificent gesture of care in the dark. They looked back through the trees, staring out at the wide, black expanse of the river they had just conquered. The water continued to flow, ancient and indifferent, the silver ripples fading into the mist. But the river was no longer a barrier, it was a memory. They had left their fears on the other side of the water, carried across by the strength of their own quiet heroism. As the deep, velvet blackness of the night began to slowly soften, hinting at the approaching dawn, the men huddled closer together. They pulled their heavy, damp collars up against the chill, closing their exhausted eyes. The final great boundary had been crossed. The unknown was now beneath their feet. They let the gentle, rhythmic sound of the river lapping against the shore rock them towards sleep, resting in the quiet, profound peace of the new earth, secure in the unwavering, beautiful love of the brothers who had rowed them through the dark. The spring breeze carried the scent of blooming wildflowers, masking a profound sorrow the world had not yet learned to name. As the long, weary columns pushed deeper into the heart of the continent, the brutal ice of winter had finally surrendered to the soft, forgiving warmth of April. The earth was waking up. The trees were beginning to bud with fragile, pale green leaves, and the sun, which had been a distant, cold ghost for so many months, now rested gently on the shoulders of the marching men. There was a quiet, unspoken hope rippling through the ranks. The skies were clear, the roads were dry, and the heavy, oppressive weight of the war felt as though it was slowly beginning to lift. There were boys dreaming of the summer, letting their minds drift to the familiar porches and the quiet, sunlit streets they had left behind. But nestled within the quiet, rolling hills and the dense, peaceful forests, a different kind of shadow was waiting. The discovery did not happen amidst the roar of engines or the chaotic rush of an advance. It happened in a terrible, heavy silence. The convoys rolled down a narrow, tree-lined dirt road, the heavy tires crunching softly against the gravel, until the trees suddenly parted to reveal a vast, unnatural clearing. There were no stone fortresses here, no trenches dug into the mud. There was only a high, towering perimeter of rusted, woven wire, stretching out endlessly beneath the pale blue sky. Behind the wire sat rows of long, dark, wooden buildings, silent and still. The engines of the trucks were slowly cut, one by one, until the only sound left in the world was the gentle rustle of the spring wind through the pines. The soldiers climbed down from their vehicles, their boots touching the dust with a strange, hesitant caution. They were hardened men now, having survived the breathless race across the summer fields, the freezing mud of autumn, and the bitter, blinding snows of the Ardennes. They thought they had seen all the sorrow the world had to offer. But as they walked slowly toward the high, silent fences, their breath caught in their throats. From the dark, shadowed doorways of the wooden buildings, and from the quiet corners of the dusty yards, people began to emerge. They moved with a fragile, agonizing slowness, stepping out into the spring sunlight like quiet ghosts stepping out of a long, terrible dream. They gathered behind the wire, their hands reaching out to rest against the rusted metal diamonds. The soldiers stopped, the heavy canvas of their uniforms suddenly feeling like lead. They looked through the wire, and the world they thought they knew quietly broke apart. There was no cheering. There were no joyful crowds throwing flowers, as there had been in the summer towns. There was only a profound, echoing stillness, and the gentle, tragic humanity of the faces looking back at them. The eyes that met the soldiers' gazes were incredibly large, dark, and hollowed by a suffering so deep and vast that the young men from the farms and the cities could not even begin to comprehend it. A young rifleman, a boy who had carried his heavy weapon across a frozen ocean of snow without shedding a single tear, slowly lowered his rifle to the earth. His hands began to tremble. He walked to the wire, taking off his heavy leather helmet, exposing his own youth, his own vulnerability, to the quiet souls on the other side. He reached out, sliding his thick, calloused fingers through the gaps in the metal, and gently touched the impossibly thin, frail hand of an elderly man. The man did not speak. He simply rested his fragile fingers against the soldier's warm hand, closing his eyes as a single, quiet tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. In that small, silent connection, the vast, terrifying machinery of the war entirely dissolved. There were no nations here, no grand strategies. There was only a boy who had crossed the world to bring the light, and a man who had waited in the dark for an eternity. The heavy iron gates were slowly pushed open, the rusted hinges crying out softly in the still air. The soldiers stepped inside, crossing the threshold into a world of unimaginable sorrow. Instinctively, the army of rough, weary men became an army of profound, gentle caretakers. They forgot their own exhaustion. They forgot the ache in their boots and the heavy miles they had walked. They unbuckled their canvas packs with urgent, quiet reverence. A mechanic, his hands forever stained with the dark grease of the engines, knelt in the dust before a small child. The child was shivering despite the warmth of the spring sun, wrapped only in a thin, tattered piece of cloth. The mechanic did not hesitate. He stripped off his own heavy, green wool jacket, the fabric soft and worn from months of travel, and gently wrapped it around the child's frail shoulders. He folded the massive sleeves up, his big, clumsy hands moving with breathtaking tenderness, and offered the child a soft, broken smile. All around the dusty compound, the soldiers were giving away everything they had. They pulled small, slightly dented tins of rations from their belts, opening them with quiet scrapes of metal. They offered squares of hard chocolate, breaking them into tiny, manageable pieces, holding them out on the palms of their hands like precious offerings. They unscrewed the caps of their metal canteens, gently lifting the water to cracked, parched lips, murmuring soft, soothing words of comfort in a language the people could not understand, but whose tone was universally known. "It's okay," they whispered over and over, their voices thick with held-back tears. "You are safe now. We are here." The medics moved through the shadows of the wooden buildings, their canvas bags open. But for many, there was no medicine left in the world that could heal the depth of their suffering. The young men with the red crosses on their helmets found themselves offering the only cure they had left, the simple, profound grace of human touch. A medic would sit on the wooden floorboards, cradling the head of a fragile, fading soul in his lap, softly humming a lullaby his mother had taught him a lifetime ago. He smoothed the hair back from a fevered forehead, offering the quiet dignity of presence, ensuring that in these final, quiet moments, they were not alone. They were held. They were loved. The emotional toll on the young soldiers was immense. There were boys who had grown up believing in the inherent, enduring goodness of the world. Standing in the shadow of the silent wire, that belief was shattered, and then, miraculously, stitched back together by the sheer force of their own empathy. When they needed a moment to breathe, they would walk back out through the gates, stepping behind the heavy steel of their parked trucks. There, hidden from the eyes of the people they had liberated, the hardened veterans of the winter woods would lean against the warm metal, bury their faces in their hands, and weep. They wept for the tragic, beautiful humanity they had found, and they wept for the dark, terrible things the world was capable of. They held onto each other, sharing this profound, agonizing sorrow in the quiet shade of the spring trees. That evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft, bruised shades of lavender and dusty rose, the men did not build their camp in the woods. They set up their tents in a wide circle entirely surrounding the wire. They became a living wall of protection, a quiet, breathing shield between the survivors and the dark. As the stars appeared, cold and clear above the sleeping forest, the men sat by their foxholes, pulling their damp, wrinkled paper from their pockets. Riding home had never felt so heavy, or so entirely necessary. They could not describe what they had seen. The words did not exist in the gentle vocabulary of their distant homes. Instead, they wrote about love. A boy from a windy plains town leaned over his paper, writing by the soft, shielded glow of a flashlight. "Mom," he wrote, his handwriting slow and careful, "please hug my little sister for me tonight. Hug her tight, and tell her that the world can be a beautiful place. I know exactly why we had to cross the water now. We are helping people remember the sun." They folded these letters, sealing them with quiet prayers, sending their profound, awakened hearts back across the ocean. They had crossed the continent blindly, following orders and lines on a map, but the silent wire had given them a holy purpose. The night deepened, wrapping the camp in a soft, forgiving blanket of shadow. The soldiers walked their posts with a slow, deliberate quiet, making sure their heavy boots did not crunch too loudly against the gravel. They did not want to wake the souls sleeping in the wooden buildings. They wanted them to rest in the profound, beautiful silence of absolute safety. A young sentry stood by the open gate, leaning gently against the cold, rusted iron. He looked out at the sleeping camp, and then up at the vast, glittering canopy of stars. The sorrow in his heart was heavy, a weight he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. But alongside the sorrow, there was a brilliant, stubborn light. He had seen the darkest corner of the world, and he had watched his brothers fill it with their own quiet, everyday love. He listened to the soft, steady breathing of the thousands of men sleeping in the grass around him, the gentle guardians of the night. He pulled his collar up against the cool spring breeze, closing his eyes, letting the quiet peace of the evening wash over him. The wire was broken. The darkness had retreated. He stood his watch, cradling the fragile, beautiful dawn in his hands, ready to keep the world safe until the morning light finally broke across the sky. The heavy, dark clouds of a long and terrible year finally began to fracture, letting the golden light of spring spill softly across the broken roads. The air had changed. For so many endless months, the wind had carried the biting, bitter scent of frost, the heavy, metallic smell of moving water, and the deep, profound sorrow of the wire. But as the columns rolled ever eastward, pushing deep into the heart of a crumbling empire, the earth finally breathed a long, sweet sigh of relief. The frozen, stubborn mud softened into rich, warm soil. The skeletal branches of the ancient, silent forests began to dress themselves in delicate, fragile buds of pale green. The world was slowly, quietly waking up from a long, agonizing nightmare, and for the young men walking the winding roads, the transformation was nothing short of a miracle. They were different men now than the boys who had waited in the damp English grass. The pale, chalky dust of summer and the gray mud of autumn had settled deep into the creases of their faces, etching a quiet, enduring wisdom around their eyes. Their heavy green coats were faded, patched, and worn soft as old linen. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their bodies finely tuned to the heavy, swaying rhythm of the march. But the frenetic, desperate energy that had driven them across the continent was gone. The breathless race had slowed to a surreal, quiet walk. The grand, terrifying machinery of the war was finally winding down. The sounds of the world shifted. The distant, rolling thunder that had haunted the horizon for a year grew faint, replaced by the gentle, beautiful return of birdsong in the leafy canopies above. The great steel tanks, their armor scarred and chipped from 1,000 unseen battles, now rolled peacefully past sweeping fields of blooming wildflowers, their heavy engines purring like tired lions returning to rest. As they marched through the valleys and the small, ancient farming villages, the landscape felt strangely, beautifully empty of threat. From the windows of the stone houses, from the wrought iron balconies, and from the steeples of the quiet churches, white sheets hung suspended in the warm spring breeze. They fluttered like tired, fragile doves against the ancient stone, a silent, universal surrender to the turning of the season and the end of the storm. The locals stood by the sides of the roads, no longer weeping, no longer cheering, but simply watching with exhausted, hollowed eyes. The soldiers did not look at them as conquerors. They looked at them with the profound, empathetic understanding of men who were equally tired. They shared a quiet, unbroken silence, acknowledging the deep, shared weariness of a world that had carried a terrible burden for far too long. Along the dusty edges of the roads, a new and surreal sight began to unfold. They were passing the men who had once been the shadows in the dark, the unseen forces in the winter woods. The enemy soldiers were walking west, moving in the opposite direction of the great advance. But there was no clash of steel, no sudden shout of alarm. The gray uniforms were torn and covered in the same pale dust as the American green. They were boys without weapons, their heads bowed, their shoulders slumped in absolute exhaustion. A young rifleman from the sunlit plains of the Midwest paused by the edge of a quiet, murmuring stream, unhooking his heavy metal canteen to fill it with the cool water. As he knelt in the soft green grass, a defeated soldier in a ragged gray coat stopped on the other side of the narrow water. They were just boys, separated by a few feet of rushing water and a uniform, both far from their mothers, both entirely hollowed out by the miles. The American boy looked down at his canvas belt. He reached into a small pouch and pulled out a slightly dented tin of sweet peaches he had been saving for a lonely night. He looked at the boy across the stream, saw the trembling, hollow exhaustion in his eyes, and simply tossed the tin underhand over the water. The gray-clad boy caught it with clumsy, shaking hands. He looked down at the tin, then up at the American, and offered a slow, profound nod of gratitude. No words were spoken. The vast, terrible machinery of nations dissolved completely in the warm spring air, leaving behind only two tired souls sharing a quiet, beautiful moment of grace by the side of a stream. As the days drifted by, bathed in the soft, hazy gold of the spring sun, a strange and fragile emotion began to bloom within the hearts of the marching men. It was an emotion they had kept buried deep beneath the ice and the mud, locked away because it was far too painful to hold. It was the realization that they might actually survive. For a year, they had lived entirely in the space of a single breath, focusing only on enduring until the next dawn. To look too far ahead was a dangerous luxury. But now, with the white flags fluttering in the breeze and the air smelling of sweet rain and blooming apple blossoms, the future began to gently tap on their shoulders. The thought of going home was sudden and dizzying. A driver, leaning his tired arms against the steering wheel of his parked truck, watched a white butterfly dance across the hood of his machine. He followed its erratic, joyful flight, and for the first time in what felt like a century, he allowed himself to truly, vividly imagine the front porch of his house. He pictured the way the wooden steps creaked under his weight. He imagined the exact, comforting smell of his father's pipe tobacco drifting through the screen door. He let the image wash over him, a warm, golden wave that made his chest ache with a sudden, overwhelming sweetness. But with this beautiful hope came a new, quiet fear. It was the fragile, breathless terror of being so close to the end. When you know the storm is breaking, every step becomes incredibly precious. They walked more carefully now. They looked at the blue sky with a profound, aching reverence. They wanted to hold onto their lives with both hands, guarding their beating hearts so they could carry them safely back across the ocean. When the long columns halted for the evening, the camps they built were no longer the tents, shivering sanctuaries of the winter. They spread their heavy canvas halves out on the soft, dry grass of the meadows, removing their boots with long, grateful sighs. The evenings were mild, the air wrapping around them like a gentle, soothing embrace. They did not hide in deep, dark trenches. They sat above the earth, leaning against the warm, rough bark of the ancient oak trees, watching the sun dip low toward the horizon. The sky painted itself in a masterpiece of shifting colors, brilliant oranges melting into soft, dusty pinks, and finally deepening into a rich, velvet lavender. In this peaceful, golden hour, the ritual of the letters changed. The paper they pulled from their pockets was no longer damp with winter condensation or stained with the mud of the trenches. They wrote with a slow, thoughtful care, their stubby pencils tracing words of profound, cautious joy. A young medic sat cross-legged in a field of daisies, resting a small, wrinkled notebook on his knee. He looked out at the rolling green hills, a soft, exhausted smile touching his lips. "My dearest," he wrote, his handwriting flowing smoothly across the page, "I think the wind is finally changing. The sky was so blue today, it looked just like the sky over the lake back home. I saw a bird building a nest in the ruins of an old wall. Even the earth knows it is time to heal. Keep the porch light burning for me. I believe, with all my heart, that I am finally walking toward the light." He folded the letter with a quiet reverence, no longer sealing away a lie to protect her, but sending a beautiful, shining truth to guide him back to her arms. As the twilight deepened into night, the vast, sleeping army settled into a profound and beautiful stillness. The sky filled with a million glittering stars, hanging low and clear above the quiet valleys. The moon rose, casting a pale, silver glow over the silent tanks and the sleeping men, turning the meadows into an ocean of soft, shimmering light. The men chosen to stand the night watch did not grip their rifles with white-knuckled terror. They stood softly at the edge of the camps, their heavy coats unbuttoned to the mild night air, their hands resting loosely on their belts. They did not stare into the dark searching for shadows, they looked up at the heavens. They listened to the gentle, rhythmic chorus of the crickets in the tall grass, a simple, ordinary sound that felt like a miraculous symphony after a year of roaring engines and breaking ice. They listened to the quiet, steady breathing of their brothers sleeping in the grass behind them. The boys were resting peacefully, their faces relaxed, the deep lines of worry finally beginning to smooth away in the dark. The frantic, pounding heartbeat of the great army had slowed to a gentle, resting pulse. A young sentry leaned his head back against a wooden fence post, closing his eyes and letting the warm spring breeze wash over his face. He felt the vast, terrifying weight of the years slowly lifting from his shoulders, drifting away into the night sky like mist burning off a morning lake. The storm had spent its fury. The thunder had rolled away over the horizon, leaving behind a world that was battered, broken, but undeniably still turning. He took a slow, deep breath of the sweet, fragrant air, holding it in his lungs for a long moment before letting it go. He was a survivor standing in the twilight, suspended in the beautiful, surreal space between the end of a nightmare and the gentle dawn of peace. He stood his watch not out of fear, but out of a profound, quiet love for the men sleeping in the grass. He would guard their dreams tonight, watching over them in the warm, forgiving dark, waiting with a patient, hopeful heart for the sun to rise and gently chase the last of the shadows away. It ended not with a thunderous roar, but with a sudden, breathless, and beautiful silence. For over a year, the world had been defined by a heavy, relentless noise. It was the deep, vibrating grumble of thousands of tank engines, the sharp, cracking thunder of the horizon, and the endless, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots marching over stone, mud, and ice. The young men had learned to live inside this cacophony, letting it become the baseline of their existence, a constant, roaring river that carried them across a fractured continent. But on this soft, golden morning in May, the river finally, miraculously, stopped flowing. The order to halt came down the line, passed from radio operators to sergeants, from sergeants to the weary boys resting by the sides of the winding dirt roads. The message was incredibly brief, but it carried the weight of the entire world. It simply said that it was over. The great, terrible storm had broken. When the engines of the massive trucks and the armored machines were finally turned off, the absence of their rumbling was a physical sensation. The air felt suddenly light, empty, and strangely pure. The men stood in the spring grass, their heavy rifles resting loosely in their hands, listening to a sound they had almost forgotten how to hear. It was the sound of the earth simply breathing. A gentle breeze rustled through the bright, new leaves of the oak trees. Somewhere in the distance, a solitary bird sang a clear, melodic sequence of notes. A quiet, babbling stream cut through the meadow, the water splashing softly over smooth, mossy stones. The young men listened to these tiny, ordinary sounds with their eyes wide, their mouths slightly parted in awe. The ringing in their ears, born of 1,000 terrifying nights, slowly began to fade, replaced by the sweet, profound symphony of peace. There was no sudden eruption of cheering. There was no wild, frantic celebration in the fields. The relief they felt was far too deep, far too heavy for noise. It was an emotion that settled into their very bones, bringing with it a sudden, overwhelming wave of exhaustion. A young driver, sitting high up in the cab of his transport truck, slowly reached out and pulled the heavy metal key from the ignition. He held the key in his dirty, calloused palm, staring at it as if he had never seen it before. For months, that key had been a symbol of endless movement, of driving into the terrifying, unknown dark. Now, it was just a piece of metal. He rested his forehead against the smooth arc of the steering wheel, closing his eyes, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was a breath he had been holding since he stepped off a boat on a cold, dusty beach an eternity ago. He felt a single, warm tear slip down his cheek, tracing a clean path through the dust, falling silently onto his canvas lap. All across the rolling, green landscape, men were slowly sitting down. They sank into the soft, fragrant grass, unbuckling their heavy canvas web gear and letting it fall to the earth with a dull, final thud. They took off their heavy steel helmets, running their trembling hands through their matted hair, letting the warm spring sun bathe their pale, tired faces. They looked at each other, really looked at each other, seeing the profound, quiet disbelief mirrored in their brother's eyes. They had survived. It was a strange, dizzying thought. For so long, survival was a minute-by-minute negotiation with the world. They had trained their minds to only look at the few feet of road directly in front of them. Now, the horizon had suddenly burst wide open, stretching out infinitely into a bright, unwritten future. Yet, intertwined with this beautiful, breathtaking relief was a deep, quiet sorrow. It was the bittersweet ache of the survivors. As they sat in the sunlit meadows, their thoughts drifted back along the thousands of miles of road they had walked. They remembered the shadows on the English grass, the swirling dust of the summer breakout, the freezing, blue-white depths of the winter woods. And they remembered the boys who had walked beside them, the boys whose laughter had kept them warm in the dark, the boys who were not sitting in the grass with them today. They did not think of their fallen brothers with despair. The violence of the past was washed away in the gentle light of the spring. Instead, they remembered them in their finest, brightest moments. A quiet farm boy from the plains remembered his friend sharing a piece of hard candy in a rain-soaked tent. A city boy remembered the way his sergeant had smiled when he talked about his little girl back home. They held these memories closely, treating them as sacred, precious things. A soldier reached for his canteen, unscrewed the cap, and poured a small, silent splash of water onto the thirsty earth. It was a quiet, private toast to the empty spaces beside them. "We made it," he whispered softly to the gentle breeze, knowing somehow that the wind would carry the message. "You can rest now. We finished the job." They carried the echoes of those lost boys in their hearts, a beautiful, enduring chorus of love that would walk with them for the rest of their lives. As the afternoon stretched out, lazy and warm, the most profound ritual of the war underwent its final, beautiful transformation. The men reached into their pockets for their paper and their pencils. But this time, their hands did not shake. They did not have to search for words to hide their fears. They did not have to spin gentle fables about the weather or the food to protect the hearts of the people they loved. A young rifleman sat on an ancient stone wall, a piece of crisp, dry paper resting on his knee. The sunlight fell across his shoulders, warming the heavy wool of his coat. He pressed his pencil to the page, and the words flowed out of him like a river breaking a dam. "My dearest," he wrote, his handwriting sweeping and joyful. "The guns have stopped. The sky is so incredibly blue today, and there is no smoke to hide the sun. I am safe. I am whole. And I am finally coming home to you." He imagined her standing in the hallway, reading those words. He imagined the exact moment the heavy, suffocating fear would lift from her shoulders, the way she would press her hand to her mouth, tears of absolute joy spilling from her eyes. He folded the letter with a profound, quiet reverence. This was not a lifeline cast into the dark, it was a promise of tomorrow. It was a ticket back to the world of the living. Down in the ancient stone villages and the winding city streets, the echoes of peace were ringing out. The heavy, wooden doors that had been locked tight against the terror of the world were thrown wide open to the spring air. The great iron bells in the church towers, which had been silent for years, began to swing. Their deep, resonant chimes rolled across the valleys, a slow, melodic, and overwhelmingly beautiful song of liberation. The people stepped out into the sunlight. They were thin, their clothes were worn, and their eyes carried the heavy shadows of the years, but their faces were lifted to the sky. Children, who had learned to play without making a sound, suddenly began to laugh. Their bright, musical voices echoed off the cobblestones, the most wondrous and healing sound the weary soldiers had ever heard. An old woman with silver hair and a deeply lined face walked slowly up to a resting soldier. She carried a small, chipped ceramic cup filled with fresh, cool milk from her only cow. She offered it to him with a trembling hand, her eyes swimming with tears. She did not know his name, and he did not know hers, but in that simple, beautiful exchange, they shared the entirety of the human experience. He took the cup, bowing his head in quiet gratitude, drinking the sweet milk and tasting the profound, enduring grace of a world that was finally beginning to heal. As the sun began to set on the first day of peace, the sky transformed into a breathtaking canvas of soft lavender, bruised peach, and deepening gold. The shadows stretched long and comforting across the meadows. For the first time in a year, the soldiers did not have to hide from the dark. They gathered fallen branches and drywood from the forests. In the center of the fields, they built campfires. They did not have to shield the flames or worry about the smoke. They let the fires burn bright and high, the warm, orange light dancing across their faces. The glow of the flames illuminated a sea of young men who had aged a lifetime, but who were now, slowly, beginning to look like boys again. They sat around the fires, sharing the last of their hoarded rations, passing canteens, and talking. Their voices were soft and relaxed. They did not talk about the long roads behind them. They talked entirely of the future. They built castles in the night air, detailing the exact meals their mothers were going to cook for them, describing the cars they were going to buy, the girls they were going to marry, the quiet, ordinary lives they were going to build from the ashes of the war. When the fires burned low, fading to a soft, pulsing bed of red embers, they laid their heavy canvas blankets out on the grass. There was no guard roster tonight. No one had to stand alone at the edge of the woods, staring into the terrifying, freezing blackness. No one had to listen for the snap of a twig or the distant rumble of an engine. The night belonged entirely to the crickets, the rustling leaves, and the quiet, soothing breath of the sleeping earth. A young soldier lay on his back, his hands folded peacefully across his chest. He looked up at the vast, glittering canopy of the night sky. The stars were brilliant and clear, a million tiny pinpricks of light shining down on a world that was finally at rest. He found the familiar constellations, tracing the invisible lines with his eyes, knowing that those exact same stars were shining down on the roof of his house, thousands of miles away across the dark ocean. He felt a profound, sweeping peace settle over his soul, wrapping around him like a warm, heavy quilt. The long march was over. The armor was shed. The beautiful, fragile dawn of a new world was waiting just over the horizon. He closed his eyes, surrendering completely to the safety of the dark. He listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of his brothers resting in the grass around him. And as he drifted down into a deep, dreamless, and profoundly beautiful sleep, he carried with him the quiet, enduring light of their shared humanity, safe at last, resting in the gentle, unbroken silence of peace.